The Chena Springs Incident. The morning mist clung to the ancient spruce trees like the breath of sleeping giants as Dr. Jessica Lane adjusted her backpack straps and gazed across the pristine Alaskan wilderness that stretched endlessly before her. The August air carried the crisp promise of autumn, though summer still held the land in its golden embrace. Beside her, her husband Robert Lane shouldered his own pack with practiced ease, his weathered hands moving with the confidence of a man who had spent the better part of 43 years exploring the untamed corners of North America. "Remember our first trip up here?" Robert asked, his voice carrying that familiar note of wonder that had first attracted Jessica to him 15 years ago during their graduate studies at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. His steel-gray eyes reflected the same adventurous spirit that had led them through countless expeditions across the last frontier, from the wind-swept tundra of the North Slope to the temperate rainforests of southeast Alaska. Jessica nodded, her auburn hair catching the early morning light as she recalled that transformative journey in 2009 when they had been nothing more than eager doctoral candidates in wildlife biology, armed with more enthusiasm than experience. "You nearly fell through the ice trying to collect water samples from that beaver pond," she replied with a soft laugh that echoed across the valley. "I was convinced I'd have to explain to your parents how I managed to lose my research partner on our very first field assignment." The memory brought warmth to her emerald eyes as she remembered how that near disaster had somehow brought them closer together, transforming what had begun as a purely professional partnership into something deeper and more meaningful. Their shared passion for understanding the delicate ecosystems of Alaska's interior had evolved into a love story written across the pages of field journals and research papers, culminating in a wedding ceremony conducted at the very hot springs they were now returning to visit. Dr. Marcus Chen, their longtime friend and colleague from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, emerged from behind their rental vehicle with his characteristic broad smile stretching across his weathered Asian features. At 38, Marcus had spent more time in Alaska's backcountry than most people spent in their hometown, his expertise in large carnivore behavior making him an invaluable member of their research team. "The thermal readings from the satellite data suggest the springs are running about 2 degrees warmer than last season," he announced, consulting the waterproof tablet that never seemed to leave his hands. "Could be related to the increased seismic activity we've been monitoring in the region." Behind Marcus, their guide and local wilderness expert, Tom Clearwater, methodically checked their supplies with the thoroughness that had kept him alive through 32 years of guiding visitors through some of Alaska's most remote and dangerous terrain. His Athabascan heritage had gifted him with an intuitive understanding of the land that complemented his formal training in wilderness survival and emergency medicine. Tom's grandfather had been one of the last traditional hunters in the region, and that ancestral knowledge flowed through Tom's veins like the glacial streams that fed the hot springs they sought. "Weather Service is calling for clear skies through the weekend," Tom said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had learned to speak only when he had something worth saying. "But you know how quickly things can change up here. We'll want to keep an eye on the western horizon, especially tomorrow afternoon." His dark eyes scanned the tree line with a vigilance that never seemed to rest, a habit developed through decades of reading the subtle signs that the wilderness used to communicate with those wise enough to listen. The fifth member of their party, Dr. Sarah Hendricks, was still inside the vehicle's passenger seat, her blonde head bent over a field notebook as she made final preparations for their 3-day expedition. As a behavioral ecologist from the University of California at Berkeley, Sarah had joined their team to study the impact of geothermal activity on local wildlife populations. Her meticulous attention to detail had earned her recognition in academic circles. But this was her first extended trip into Alaska's interior, and she approached the adventure with the enthusiasm of a scholar finally given access to a legendary library. The historical records indicate that the Chena Hot Springs area has supported a remarkably stable ecosystem for at least the past century, Sarah called out through the open window, her voice carrying the excitement that always accompanied the beginning of a new research project. The thermal features create a unique microclimate that extends the growing season and supports plant species typically found much further south. It's like a biological island in the middle of the boreal forest. Completing their group was Jake Morrison, a 26-year-old wilderness photographer and documentary filmmaker whose rugged good looks and easy charm had made him a favorite among adventure magazines and nature documentary producers. Jake's presence on the expedition served multiple purposes. His stunning photography would help document their research for future grant applications, while his filmmaking skills would create valuable educational content for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's public outreach programs. "I've been monitoring the wildlife cameras we installed last month," Jake announced, shouldering his expensive camera equipment with the casual ease of someone who had learned to treat thousands of dollars worth of gear as merely tools of his trade. The motion sensors picked up some interesting activity around the springs, including what appears to be a massive male brown bear that's been visiting the area regularly during the early morning hours. Robert's expression grew more serious at this information, his years of experience in bear country making him acutely aware of the potential implications. "How massive are we talking?" he asked, moving closer to examine the small viewing screen on Jake's digital camera. "And how recent were these recordings?" Jake scrolled through the stored footage with practiced fingers, his brow furrowing as he located the relevant files. "The timestamps show activity from 3 nights ago through yesterday morning. Based on the reference markers we established, I'd estimate this animal at close to 9 feet when standing on its hind legs, probably pushing 800 pounds or more." He paused the playback on a particularly clear image that showed the enormous bear moving through the frame with surprising grace for such a massive creature. Tom stepped forward to examine the footage, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he studied the bear's posture and movement patterns. "That's a mature boar," he observed, his voice carrying a note of caution that made everyone pay closer attention. "See how he's moving with his head down, sniffing constantly. He's scent-marking territory, establishing dominance over the area around the springs." The implications of Tom's assessment hung in the air like morning fog as the group absorbed this information. Brown bears, the interior Alaska subspecies of grizzly bear, were among North America's most formidable predators, with mature males capable of reaching weights exceeding 1,000 pounds. Their intelligence, combined with their tremendous strength and surprising speed, made them a force of nature that demanded absolute respect from anyone venturing into their domain. Dr. Chen consulted his tablet again, pulling up the most recent bear activity reports for the region. Fish and Game hasn't received any problem bear reports from this area in over 18 months, he announced, though his tone suggested this might not be entirely reassuring. The last documented human-bear encounter in the Chena Hot Springs vicinity was a brief sighting in April of last year, involving a sow with cubs that showed no aggressive behavior toward hikers. Jessica felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension as she contemplated the prospect of sharing the wilderness with such a magnificent and potentially dangerous creature. Her research had brought her into contact with brown bears on numerous occasions, but she never failed to experience a profound sense of awe when encountering these apex predators in their natural habitat. "We'll need to be especially careful about food storage and waste management," she said, her scientific training automatically shifting into risk assessment mode. "A mature male that's been frequenting the area might view our presence as territorial intrusion." Sarah looked up from her notebook with wide eyes, her California upbringing having provided limited exposure to large predators. "Should we consider postponing the trip?" she asked, her voice carrying just a hint of uncertainty. "I mean, I'm not afraid of bears in general, but an aggressive territorial male sounds like something we should probably avoid." Tom shook his head with the confidence of someone who had navigated countless potentially dangerous situations in the wilderness. "Running into that bear is actually pretty unlikely if we follow proper protocol," he explained, his voice taking on the patient tone of an experienced teacher. "Brown bears typically avoid human contact whenever possible, especially during daylight hours. As long as we make noise when we're moving through dense vegetation, store our food properly, and maintain situational awareness, we should be fine." Robert nodded his agreement, though his expression remained thoughtful as he considered the various factors involved in their decision. "The springs are large enough to accommodate both bears and humans without territorial overlap," he added, drawing upon his extensive experience in bear country. "Most bear encounters occur when humans surprise bears at close range, or when bears associate humans with food sources. Since we'll be announcing our presence and maintaining a clean camp, the odds of a confrontation are minimal." Jake was already envisioning the incredible footage he might capture if they encountered the massive bear at a safe distance. "Having a dominant male in the area actually presents an amazing documentary opportunity," he said, his excitement evident in his voice. "Brown bear behavior around geothermal features is something that's rarely been filmed in such detail. As long as we maintain appropriate distance and safety protocols, this could result in some groundbreaking wildlife footage." The group spent another 30 minutes reviewing their safety procedures and emergency protocols, ensuring that everyone understood the proper responses to various bear encounter scenarios. Tom conducted a thorough inspection of their bear spray canisters, checking expiration dates and demonstrating proper deployment techniques for Sarah's benefit. Each team member carried 2 canisters of the potent oleoresin capsicum spray, along with backup whistles and emergency beacons that could summon rescue assistance if needed. Their vehicle, a modified Ford Expedition that had been specially equipped for wilderness research, contained additional safety equipment, including emergency medical supplies, satellite communication devices, and enough food and water to sustain the entire team for a week if necessary. Tom had personally overseen the packing process, his methodical approach ensuring that every piece of equipment had been properly secured and was easily accessible in case of emergency. As they began their hike into the wilderness, the morning sun climbed steadily higher, casting long shadows through the towering spruce and birch trees that dominated the landscape. The trail they followed had been established decades earlier by early prospectors and trappers, its well-worn path winding through a diverse ecosystem that supported an impressive variety of wildlife species. Moose tracks pressed deep into the soft earth, told stories of massive animals moving through the area during the night, while the delicate impressions left by snowshoe hares spoke of the ongoing drama of predator and prey that played out daily in this remote corner of Alaska. Jessica found herself falling into the meditative rhythm that always accompanied her wilderness expeditions, her breathing synchronizing with her steady pace as she absorbed the countless details that surrounded them. The air carried the rich sense of decomposing vegetation, pine resin, and the distinctive mineral smell that indicated their proximity to geothermal features. Somewhere in the distance, a raven's harsh call echoed through the forest, while the gentle murmur of running water suggested they were approaching one of the many streams that fed the hot springs. "The vegetation density is definitely increasing as we approach the thermal zone," Sarah observed, her voice filled with scientific curiosity as she documented their surroundings. "The extended growing season created by the geothermal heat is supporting plant communities that are remarkably diverse for this latitude. I'm seeing species here that typically require much warmer climates. Marcus paused to examine a cluster of unusual flowering plants that thrived in the mineral-rich soil created by centuries of geothermal activity. The springs create a unique ecological niche that supports both temperate and boreal species, he explained, his expertise in ecosystem dynamics evident in his observations. It's like having a small piece of southern Canada transplanted into the heart of Alaska's interior. The trail began to climb more steeply as they approached the ridge that overlooked the Hot Springs Valley, the terrain becoming increasingly challenging as they navigated around massive boulders and fallen trees. Tom led the way with sure-footed confidence, his intimate knowledge of the area allowing him to select the safest and most efficient route through the obstacles. Behind him, the rest of the team followed in single file, their conversation reduced to occasional observations and warnings about tricky footing. Robert found himself thinking about the research project that had brought them to this remote location, a comprehensive study of how geothermal activity influenced wildlife behavior and ecosystem dynamics in Alaska's interior. Their preliminary data suggested that the hot springs served as crucial habitat during the harsh winter months, providing both thermal refuge and access to unfrozen water when temperatures dropped to 40 below zero or colder. Understanding these relationships was becoming increasingly important as climate change altered traditional patterns throughout the Arctic and subarctic regions. The bear activity Jake documented might actually be related to our research objectives, Robert mused aloud as they crested the ridge and began their descent toward the valley floor. Brown bears have been observed using geothermal features in Yellowstone and other locations, but the behavior patterns here in Alaska haven't been systematically studied. Jake nodded enthusiastically, already planning camera angles and filming strategies for documenting any bear activity they might encounter. The thermal imaging capabilities of my new camera system should allow us to capture detailed footage of how bears interact with the hot springs environment, he said, patting the expensive equipment case that contained his state-of-the-art filming gear. We might be able to document thermoregulatory behaviors that have never been recorded before. As they descended into the valley, the sound of rushing water grew progressively louder, punctuated by the distinctive bubbling and steaming sounds that indicated active geothermal features. The air grew noticeably warmer and more humid, carrying the sulphurous smell that always accompanied natural hot springs. Through the trees ahead, they could see wisps of steam rising into the clear morning air, marking the location of the springs that had drawn visitors to this remote valley for thousands of years. Tom called a halt about 200 yards from the springs, his experienced eyes scanning the area for any signs of recent bear activity before allowing the group to proceed. "We'll establish our base camp on that elevated area over there," he announced, pointing to a relatively flat section of ground that offered good visibility in all directions while remaining well away from any established wildlife travel corridors. "The thermal vents will provide natural heating for our camp, but we'll want to position our tents to avoid direct exposure to the sulfur emissions." The process of establishing their camp took nearly 2 hours, with each team member contributing their specialized skills to create a safe and comfortable base of operations. Jessica and Robert worked together to assemble the weather-resistant shelters that would house their team for the next 3 nights, while Marcus set up the sophisticated monitoring equipment that would record environmental data throughout their stay. Sarah began documenting the plant communities that thrived in the unique microclimate, her enthusiasm evident as she discovered species after species that represented remarkable adaptations to the geothermal environment. Jake busied himself with establishing camera positions that would allow him to capture both wildlife activity and the team's research activities. his artistic eye selecting angles that would showcase the otherworldly beauty of the steaming springs against the backdrop of pristine wilderness. Tom maintained his vigilant watch over the entire operation, his attention divided between supervising the camp setup and monitoring their surroundings for any signs of potentially dangerous wildlife. By early afternoon, their base camp had been transformed into a small but efficient research station, complete with laboratory equipment, communication devices, and all the creature comforts necessary for an extended stay in the wilderness. The hot springs themselves lay just 50 yards away, a series of natural pools carved into the rocky landscape by centuries of geothermal activity. The largest pool, roughly 15 feet across and perhaps 4 feet deep at its center, maintained a constant temperature of approximately 104 degrees Fahrenheit, creating an inviting oasis of warmth in the cool mountain air. "The mineral content of these springs is absolutely fascinating," Sarah announced after completing her initial water chemistry analysis. "The dissolved sulfur, calcium and magnesium levels are creating conditions that support unique microbial communities. I'm finding bacterial species here that are typically associated with much more extreme geothermal environments." Marcus nodded as he reviewed the preliminary data from his environmental monitoring stations. "The thermal stability of these springs is remarkable," he observed, pointing to the steady temperature readings displayed on his tablet. "Most geothermal features in Alaska show significant seasonal variation, but these pools have maintained consistent temperatures for as long as we've been monitoring them." As the afternoon progressed, the team settled into the comfortable routine that characterized their best research expeditions. Jessica and Robert worked together to collect water samples from various thermal features, their synchronized movements reflecting years of collaborative fieldwork. Marcus continued monitoring environmental conditions while coordinating with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game headquarters via satellite phone. Sarah expanded her botanical survey to include the entire valley, her notebook filling with detailed observations about plant adaptations and community structures. Jake divided his time between filming the team's research activities and establishing remote cameras at strategic locations around the springs. His motion-activated systems would operate continuously throughout their stay, potentially capturing wildlife behavior that occurred during their absence. The prospect of documenting the massive brown bear that had been frequenting the area added an element of excitement to what might otherwise have been routine scientific documentation. "I'm going to position the primary camera cluster about 30 yards downstream from the main pool," Jake announced, as he shouldered his equipment and headed toward a grove of mature spruce trees that offered excellent sight lines while providing natural camouflage for his gear. "The prevailing wind patterns should carry our scent away from that location, making it less likely that wildlife will detect the cameras." Tom accompanied Jake to ensure the camera placement wouldn't inadvertently create any safety hazards or interfere with potential escape routes if bear encounters occurred. His knowledge of wildlife behavior patterns proved invaluable as they selected positions that would maximize filming opportunities while minimizing risks to both equipment and personnel. As evening approached, the team gathered around their portable camp stove to prepare dinner and discuss their observations from the first day. The dehydrated meals that comprised their backcountry rations were supplemented by fresh bread and cheese that Tom had packed for their first night in the field. The simple fare tasted extraordinary in the pristine wilderness setting, accompanied by hot tea and the satisfaction that came from a productive day of research activities. The preliminary data suggests that the geothermal activity is supporting a much more complex ecosystem than we initially anticipated, Robert observed, as he reviewed the day's findings. The diversity of microbial communities alone represents a significant research opportunity, and Sarah's botanical survey is revealing plant adaptations that could have important implications for understanding climate change responses. Jessica nodded her agreement while consulting her own field notes. The water chemistry data indicates that these springs are connected to a much larger geothermal system than previously documented, she added, her excitement evident in her voice. The mineral signatures suggest deep crustal heating sources that could extend for miles beneath the surface. As darkness settled over the valley, the team completed their evening safety protocols, securing all food items in bear-proof containers and ensuring that their camp remained free of any scents that might attract unwanted wildlife visitors. The hot springs took on an almost magical quality in the moonlight, steam rising like ghostly apparitions against the star-filled sky. The contrast between the warm pools and the cool night air created an irresistible invitation to experience the springs as countless visitors had done throughout the centuries. "Who's up for a nighttime soak?" Robert asked, his voice carrying the anticipation of someone who had been looking forward to this moment all day. "The springs should be absolutely perfect right now, and we'll have complete privacy to enjoy them without worrying about disturbing wildlife." Jessica needed no further encouragement, having already begun gathering towels and changing into her swimsuit. The prospect of relaxing in the natural hot pools after a long day of hiking and research activities was too appealing to resist. "The mineral content should be excellent for tired muscles," she observed, her scientific training automatically providing justification for what was essentially pure pleasure. Sarah hesitated briefly, her unfamiliarity with wilderness bathing creating some uncertainty about the wisdom of entering the springs during darkness. "Is it safe to be in the water at night?" she asked, her California background having provided limited experience with such activities. "I mean, what if wildlife shows up while we're in the springs?" Tom smiled reassuringly as he explained the safety considerations that govern nighttime activities in bear country. "Brown bears are typically most active during dawn and dusk hours," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of extensive experience. "By full darkness, they've usually settled into their bedding areas for the night. As long as we make some noise and keep our bear spray within easy reach, we should be fine." Marcus was already changing into his swimming trunks, his enthusiasm for the hot springs evident in his eager preparations. "I've been looking forward to this all week," he announced, gathering his towel and waterproof flashlight. "After spending the last month analyzing budget reports and attending administrative meetings, soaking in natural hot springs feels like the perfect antidote to civilization." Jake decided to use the opportunity to capture some nighttime footage of the team enjoying the springs, his filmmaker's instincts recognizing the visual appeal of steam-shrouded figures silhouetted against moonlit water. "The contrast between the thermal pools and the surrounding wilderness should create some absolutely stunning imagery," he explained as he prepared his low-light camera equipment. "This could be perfect for establishing the human connection to these natural features." Within 30 minutes, most of the team had gathered at the edge of the largest hot spring pool, their voices creating a comfortable murmur that blended with the natural sounds of bubbling water and gentle wind through the surrounding trees. The mineral-rich water felt incredibly soothing against their skin, the perfect temperature for relaxing tired muscles and washing away the accumulated stress of their journey into the wilderness. Jessica settled into her favorite position near the center of the pool, the warm water lapping gently around her shoulders as she gazed up at the brilliant display of stars that was only visible in locations far from artificial light pollution. "This is exactly what I needed," she murmured contentedly, her voice barely audible above the soft bubbling of the thermal vents. "Sometimes I forget how healing it can be to just exist in these natural spaces without any agenda beyond simple appreciation." Robert moved closer to his wife, their bodies touching companionably in the warm water as they shared this moment of perfect tranquility. "Remember our wedding night?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the warmth of cherished memories. "We spent hours in these same springs, talking about all the adventures we wanted to share and all the research projects we wanted to tackle together." The memory brought smiles to both their faces as they recalled that magical evening 6 years earlier when they had exchanged vows in a simple ceremony conducted beside these very springs. Their small wedding party had included many of the same friends and colleagues who continued to share their passion for Alaska's wilderness, creating a continuity that made this return visit feel like a homecoming rather than just another research expedition. Marcus floated nearby, his eyes closed as he allowed the warm water to ease the tension from his shoulders and back. "I can't believe it's been 6 years since your wedding," he observed, his voice carrying a note of wonder at how quickly time seemed to pass. "It feels like yesterday that we were all young graduate students with more enthusiasm than experience." Sarah had initially remained near the edge of the pool, her uncertainty about wilderness bathing making her cautious about venturing into deeper water. However, the obviously relaxed atmosphere and the incredible sensation of the mineral-rich water gradually overcame her hesitation, and she found herself moving toward the center of the pool where the others had gathered. "The water temperature is absolutely perfect," she announced with obvious surprise and delight. "I was expecting it to be either too hot or too cold, but this feels like a perfectly calibrated spa experience. The mineral content is creating this incredibly silky feeling against my skin." Jake continued documenting their experience from various angles, his camera equipment allowing him to capture both the intimate human moments and the broader environmental context that made the scene so compelling. The interplay of steam, moonlight, and relaxed human figures created imagery that perfectly captured the healing power of these natural thermal features. "The indigenous peoples of this region have been using these springs for thousands of years," Tom observed from his position near the pool's edge, where he maintained his vigilant watch over their surroundings while still participating in the group's conversation. "My grandfather used to tell stories about hunting parties that would stop here to rest and heal before continuing their journeys. He said the springs had spiritual significance as well as practical value." As the evening progressed, the team found themselves sharing stories and observations that went far beyond their immediate research objectives. The combination of warm water, pristine wilderness, and trusted companionship created an atmosphere that encouraged deeper conversations about their motivations, fears, and dreams. Jessica found herself reflecting on the path that had led her from a childhood fascination with nature to her current position as a respected wildlife researcher. "I think what I love most about this work is the constant sense of discovery," she mused aloud, her voice carrying the thoughtfulness that often emerged during quiet moments in the wilderness. "Every expedition brings new questions and new insights, but it also reminds me how much we still don't understand about these complex ecosystems." Robert nodded his agreement, his own career having been driven by similar curiosity about the natural world. "The more we learn, the more we realize how interconnected everything is," he observed, gesturing toward the forest that surrounded them. "These springs don't exist in isolation. They're part of a vast network of geological, biological, and climatological systems that we're only beginning to comprehend." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours as the team enjoyed the perfect conditions and the rare opportunity to relax completely in such a pristine natural setting. The stress and fatigue of their journey seemed to dissolve in the mineral-rich water, replaced by a profound sense of contentment and connection to the wilderness that surrounded them. Eventually, the combination of warm water and the late hour began to take its toll, and team members started making their way back to the camp for some much-needed rest. The plan called for an early start the following morning, with ambitious research goals that would require everyone to be alert and energetic. One by one, they reluctantly left the springs and made their way back to their tents, their voices gradually fading as they settled in for the night. Jessica and Robert were among the last to leave the water, their reluctance to end this perfect evening evident in their slow movements and frequent pauses to savor the experience. "We should do this more often," Jessica suggested as they finally made their way toward shore. Not just the research trips, but taking time to really appreciate these incredible places without constantly working. "Absolutely," Robert agreed, wrapping a towel around his shoulders as the cool night air contrasted sharply with the warm water they had just left. "Sometimes I get so focused on collecting data and meeting research objectives that I forget to simply experience the wonder of being in these amazing locations." As they walked back toward their tent, hand in hand under the brilliant star-filled sky, both Jessica and Robert felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life they had built together. Their shared passion for wilderness research had taken them to some of the most beautiful and remote locations on Earth, but it was moments like these, quiet, intimate, and perfectly peaceful, that reminded them why they had chosen this path. The night passed quietly, with only the gentle sounds of bubbling springs and occasional wildlife calls disturbing the tranquil atmosphere that blanketed their camp. The team slept deeply, their bodies relaxed from the hot springs and their minds at peace in the pristine wilderness setting. The sophisticated monitoring equipment that Marcus had deployed continued recording environmental data throughout the night, while Jake's motion-activated cameras maintained their silent vigil over the springs and surrounding area. Dawn arrived gradually, painting the eastern sky with soft pastels that reflected beautifully off the steam rising from the thermal pools. The air carried a crisp freshness that spoke of the approaching autumn season, though summer still maintained its hold over the land. Jessica was among the first to wake, her internal clock having adjusted to wilderness rhythms that synchronized with natural light cycles rather than artificial schedules. She emerged from her tent to find the valley shrouded in a light mist that created an almost ethereal atmosphere around the springs. The combination of cool morning air and warm geothermal features produced conditions that seemed to blur the boundaries between earth and sky, creating a landscape that belonged more to dreams than to waking reality. "Good morning, beautiful," Robert's voice came from behind her as he emerged from their tent, his hair tousled from sleep, but his eyes bright with the anticipation of another day in this incredible location. "Sleep well." "Like a baby," Jessica replied, stretching her arms above her head as she absorbed the peaceful morning atmosphere. "There's something about being in places like this that allows my mind to completely let go of all the stress and noise from civilization. I feel more rested after one night here than I do after a week of normal sleep back home." Tom was already awake and moving quietly around the camp, his early rising habits allowing him to assess conditions and ensure everything remained secure before the rest of the team began their day. His practiced eyes scanned the area for any signs of overnight wildlife activity, checking for tracks, scat, or other indicators that large animals had passed through their vicinity during the night. "Looks like we had some visitors," he announced quietly, pointing to a set of large tracks pressed deep into the soft earth near the springs. "Moose, probably a large cow, came through sometime after midnight." She stopped to drink from the outflow stream before continuing north toward the main valley. Marcus emerged from his tent with his tablet already in hand, eager to review the overnight data that his monitoring stations had collected. The thermal readings remained remarkably stable throughout the night, he reported, his scientific enthusiasm evident even in the early morning hours. The temperature variations were less than 1 degree, which is extraordinary for a natural system. Sarah appeared shortly afterward, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail as she prepared for another day of intensive botanical fieldwork. "I'm planning to expand my survey to include the Upper Valley today," she announced, consulting the detailed topographic maps that guided their research activities. "The preliminary species list is already exceeding my expectations, and I suspect there are rare endemic plants in the areas closest to the thermal vents." Jake was the last to emerge, his nocturnal filming activities having kept him active well past midnight as he documented the incredible night sky and thermal features under moonlight conditions. "The footage from last night is absolutely spectacular," he reported, reviewing the previous evening's recordings on his camera's display screen. "The motion sensors didn't pick up any large wildlife activity around the springs, but I got some amazing shots of the aurora that appeared just before dawn." The team gathered around their portable camp stove for breakfast, the simple meal of instant oatmeal, dried fruit, and coffee taking on special significance in the pristine wilderness setting. The combination of warm food, good companionship, and the incredible natural beauty that surrounded them created a sense of contentment that reminded everyone why they had chosen careers that brought them to such remote and spectacular locations. The research planned for today includes comprehensive water sampling from all the thermal features in the Upper Valley, Robert announced as he reviewed their scientific objectives. "We'll also want to establish monitoring stations at several new locations to expand our data collection network." Jessica nodded as she consulted her own research notes. "I'm particularly interested in documenting the microbial communities in the highest temperature pools," she added, her expertise in extremophile bacteria making her uniquely qualified to study organisms that thrived in conditions that would be lethal to most life forms. "The preliminary samples suggest we might be dealing with species that haven't been previously documented in Alaska." As they prepared for their day's activities, the morning mist gradually dissipated, revealing the full splendor of the wilderness that surrounded their camp. The valley stretched away in all directions, its pristine forests and meadows supporting an incredible diversity of wildlife species that had learned to coexist with the unique geothermal environment. The research activities proceeded smoothly throughout the morning, with each team member contributing their specialized expertise to the comprehensive study they were conducting. Jessica and Robert worked together to collect samples from increasingly remote thermal features, their synchronized movements reflecting years of collaborative fieldwork in challenging environments. Marcus maintained his environmental monitoring network while coordinating with headquarters via satellite phone, ensuring that their research activities remained properly documented and that emergency support remained available if needed. His reports back to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game provided valuable real-time data about conditions in this remote corner of the state. Sarah's botanical survey continued to yield surprising discoveries as she documented plant species that seemed to defy conventional understanding of their geographic ranges. The unique microclimate created by the geothermal features was clearly supporting communities of organisms that existed nowhere else in the region, making this valley a biological treasure trove of exceptional scientific significance. Jake divided his time between documenting the team's research activities and maintaining his network of remote cameras that monitored wildlife activity throughout the area. His motion-activated systems had captured several interesting recordings during the night, including footage of a family of red foxes investigating the thermal features and a brief appearance by what appeared to be a large lynx moving through the upper valley. As midday approached, the team decided to take a break from their intensive research activities and enjoy another relaxing session in the hot springs. The combination of physical exertion and the cool mountain air made the prospect of soaking in the warm mineral water particularly appealing, and everyone looked forward to the opportunity to rest and recharge before continuing their work. "I think this might be the perfect time for that soak we've been planning," Jessica suggested as she completed her analysis of the morning's water samples. "The springs should be at their optimal temperature, and we could all use a break from the intensive data collection." Robert enthusiastically agreed, having been looking forward to another opportunity to experience the incredible healing properties of the mineral-rich water. "The muscle soreness from yesterday's hike is definitely making itself known," he observed, stretching his back as he spoke. "A good soak should help prepare us for this afternoon's activities." Tom completed his routine security check of the area, his experienced eyes scanning for any signs of wildlife activity that might indicate the need for additional caution. "The area looks clear," he announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had spent decades reading the subtle signs that the wilderness used to communicate potential dangers. "We should be fine for a relaxing session in the springs." The team gathered their towels and personal items, making their way toward the largest of the thermal pools with the anticipation of tired researchers who had earned their relaxation through hard work and careful planning. The steam rising from the water created an inviting atmosphere that promised both physical comfort and spiritual renewal in the heart of Alaska's pristine wilderness. Jessica was the first to enter the water, her sigh of contentment audible as the warm, mineral-rich springs enveloped her body. "This never gets old," she murmured, settling into her preferred position near the center of the pool, where the temperature remained most consistent. "I could stay here for hours and never get tired of this incredible sensation." Robert joined her moments later, his own expression of relief evident as the warm water began working its magic on his tired muscles. "It's amazing how these natural features can provide such perfect conditions for relaxation," he observed, moving closer to Jessica as they shared this moment of tranquil intimacy in the wilderness setting they both loved. Marcus lowered himself into the pool with obvious appreciation, his eyes closing as he allowed the warm water to ease the tension from his shoulders and neck. "After spending the morning hunched over monitoring equipment, this feels absolutely therapeutic," he announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone experiencing genuine physical relief. Sarah entered the water more cautiously, her relative inexperience with wilderness hot springs making her mindful of potential hazards even as she appreciated the incredible sensation of the mineral-rich water against her skin. "The temperature is absolutely perfect," she observed with obvious surprise and delight. "I was worried it might be too hot or too cold, but this feels like it was designed specifically for human comfort." Jake positioned himself near the edge of the pool where he could continue documenting their experience while also participating in the relaxing session. His waterproof camera equipment allowed him to capture both the intimate human moments and the broader environmental context that made their situation so special. The indigenous peoples who used these springs for thousands of years clearly understood something profound about the healing power of these natural features, Tom observed from his position, where he could maintain awareness of their surroundings while still enjoying the warm water. "My grandfather always said that the springs had the ability to heal both body and spirit." As the team settled into their comfortable positions around the pool, the conversation naturally turned to reflections on their research findings and observations about the incredible ecosystem that surrounded them. The combination of warm water, pristine wilderness, and trusted companionship created an atmosphere that encouraged deeper discussions about their work and their personal motivations. "What strikes me most about this place is how perfectly balanced everything seems," Jessica mused, her voice carrying the thoughtfulness that often emerged during quiet moments in remarkable natural settings. The geothermal features, the plant communities, the wildlife populations, everything appears to exist in this harmonious relationship that's been developing for thousands of years. Robert nodded his agreement, his own observations supporting Jessica's assessment of the ecological balance they were witnessing. It's like seeing a glimpse of how natural systems function when they're allowed to develop without human interference, he added, gesturing toward the forest that surrounded them. The complexity and stability of these relationships is absolutely remarkable. The peaceful atmosphere was suddenly shattered by a sound that made everyone in the hot springs freeze with terror. From somewhere in the forest behind their camp came a deep, resonant huffing noise, followed by the unmistakable sound of massive paws moving through heavy underbrush. The noise was unlike anything most of them had ever heard, a combination of labored breathing and purposeful movement that could only belong to a very large animal approaching their location. Tom's expression instantly shifted from relaxed enjoyment to focused alertness as his experienced ears identified the source of the sounds. "That's a bear," he announced in a low, urgent voice that carried absolute certainty. "A big one, and it's heading this way." The implications of his words hit the group like a physical blow as they realized their extremely vulnerable position. They were naked and unarmed in the middle of a hot spring pool, with their bear spray and other safety equipment located back at their camp nearly 50 yards away. The approaching animal was moving with obvious purpose toward their location, its heavy footfalls creating an ominous rhythm that seemed to count down toward inevitable confrontation. "Everyone stay calm and don't make any sudden movements," Tom instructed, his voice maintaining steady authority even as his eyes scanned desperately for options that might improve their survival chances. "We need to get out of this pool and reach our bear spray, but we have to do it without triggering an aggressive response." Jessica felt her heart hammering against her ribs as adrenaline flooded her system, her scientific knowledge of brown bear behavior providing terrifying clarity about the potential outcomes of their situation. A mature, male brown bear could cover the distance between the forest and their position in a matter of seconds, far faster than any human could possibly move on land. Their nakedness and isolation in the hot springs had transformed what should have been a relaxing experience into a potentially fatal trap. The huffing sounds grew progressively louder and closer, accompanied by the distinctive sound of a large animal breaking through heavy vegetation as it approached their position. Through the trees, they could see branches moving and hear the crack of deadfall being crushed under enormous weight. Whatever was approaching them was massive and moving with determined purpose toward the hot springs where they sat helplessly exposed. "There," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she pointed toward a gap in the trees where something large and dark was becoming visible through the forest. "I can see it." The massive brown bear that emerged from the tree line was even larger than the footage from Jake's trail cameras had suggested. Standing nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder while on all fours, the enormous male moved with surprising grace despite his intimidating bulk. His thick brown coat rippled over muscles that spoke of tremendous power, while his massive head swung back and forth as he tested the air with his incredible sense of smell. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed, his voice filled with awe and terror as he witnessed the magnificent and terrifying predator that had discovered their location. "That animal has to weigh 800 pounds or more." The bear paused at the edge of the clearing, his small, dark eyes scanning the hot springs area as he processed the unusual scene before him. His massive head tilted slightly as he studied the humans in the water, his intelligence evident in the calculating way he assessed this unprecedented situation. For several heart-stopping moments, predator and prey regarded each other across the steaming pools, the tension so thick it seemed to crystallize in the cool mountain air. "He's trying to decide what we are and whether we represent a threat," Tom explained in barely audible whisper, his extensive experience with bear behavior allowing him to read the subtle signs of the animal's thought process. "Our scent is probably confusing him because we're in the water and partially masked by the mineral smell from the springs." The bear took a tentative step closer to the hot springs, his massive paws making no sound despite his enormous weight. His nostrils flared as he tested the air more thoroughly, trying to categorize the strange creatures he had discovered in what he clearly considered his territory. The intelligence in his dark eyes was unmistakable as he processed information and formulated his response to this unexpected intrusion. "We need to make ourselves appear larger and more threatening," Tom instructed, his voice remaining steady despite the obvious danger they faced. "Slowly stand up in the water and raise your arms above your heads. Don't make any sudden movements, but we need to establish ourselves as potentially dangerous rather than prey animals." Following Tom's guidance, the team members slowly rose to standing positions in the hot springs pool, their arms extended overhead as they attempted to project confidence and strength despite their obvious vulnerability. The contrast between their naked human forms and the massive predator watching them created a scene that seemed to belong more to nightmares than to waking reality. The bear's reaction to their movement was immediate and alarming. His massive head lowered slightly as his posture shifted from curious investigation to focused attention. The muscles beneath his thick coat tensed visibly as he prepared for potential action, his entire body language communicating increased threat assessment and possible aggressive intent. "He's getting agitated," Tom observed, his voice carrying a note of concern that sent chills through everyone in the pool. "Our movement might have triggered his defensive instincts rather than discouraging his approach." The enormous brown bear took another step closer to the hot springs, closing the distance between them to less than 30 yards. At this range, they could see every detail of his massive form, the incredible size of his paws, the thickness of his coat, the way his small ears swiveled constantly to monitor sounds from all directions. His breathing had become more pronounced, creating visible puffs of vapor in the cool air as his metabolic rate increased in preparation for potential action. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear as she struggled to maintain the upright posture that Tom had recommended. "He's getting closer, and we're completely trapped in this pool." Before Tom could respond, the situation deteriorated dramatically as the massive bear suddenly rose onto his hind legs, his full height revealed as nearly 9 feet of muscle, bone, and predatory instinct. Standing upright, the enormous animal towered over the humans in the hot springs like a furry mountain of potential violence. His dark eyes locked onto theirs with unmistakable intelligence and growing aggression. "Nobody move," Tom commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority despite the terror that gripped them all. "He's trying to get a better look at us and assess the threat level. Any sudden movement could trigger an attack." The bear remained standing for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds, his massive head turning slightly as he studied each member of the group individually. His incredible sense of smell was clearly providing him with detailed information about their fear, their location, and their complete helplessness in the face of his overwhelming physical superiority. When the enormous predator dropped back down to all fours, his movement was accompanied by a sound that would haunt their nightmares for years to come. A deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from the very depths of his massive chest. The sound was part growl, part huff, and entirely threatening, communicating his growing irritation with their presence in his territory. "He's made his decision," Tom announced, his voice carrying grim certainty about what was about to happen. "Everyone get ready to fight for your lives." The massive brown bear's charge began without warning, his enormous bulk accelerating with shocking speed across the short distance that separated him from the hot springs pool. Despite weighing nearly 800 pounds, the magnificent predator moved with the fluid grace of a creature perfectly designed for exactly this type of violent encounter. His massive paws threw up clouds of earth and vegetation as he covered the ground between them in a matter of heartbeats. Jessica's scream pierced the morning air as she realized that death was thundering toward them with unstoppable momentum. The scientific part of her mind noted with detached fascination that brown bears could reach speeds of 35 miles per hour over short distances, making escape impossible for humans caught in open terrain. The rest of her consciousness was overwhelmed by primal terror as 800 pounds of predatory muscle bore down on their helpless group. Robert instinctively moved toward Jessica, his protective instincts overriding rational thought as he attempted to position himself between his wife and the approaching bear. His movement through the water seemed impossibly slow compared to the lightning-fast approach of the enormous predator, but he continued struggling toward her with desperate determination, despite the futility of his efforts. The bear's impact with the hot springs created an explosion of water and steam that transformed the tranquil pool into a churning cauldron of violence and chaos. His massive bulk displaced hundreds of gallons of mineral-rich water as he plunged into the thermal feature with Jessica and Robert directly in his path. The contrast between the warm water and his thick coat created clouds of vapor that obscured visibility and added an element of nightmarish surrealism to the attack. Jessica felt the bear's massive paws strike her shoulder with crushing force, the impact spinning her around and driving her beneath the surface of the hot springs. The mineral-rich water that had seemed so therapeutic moments earlier now threatened to drown her as she struggled to orient herself in the churning chaos created by the massive predator's presence in the pool. Robert's attempt to reach his wife brought him into direct contact with the enormous bear, his naked body colliding with muscles and bone that felt as solid as granite. The bear's massive head swung toward him with predatory focus, jaws that could crush a moose's skull opening to reveal teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. The intelligent dark eyes that had seemed curious moments earlier now blazed with killing fury. The bear's massive jaws clamped down on Robert's torso with crushing force, puncturing his ribs and driving him beneath the surface of the hot springs with tremendous violence. His scream was cut short as mineral-rich water flooded his lungs. The healing springs transformed into an instrument of drowning as the enormous predator held him submerged with overwhelming strength. Jessica surfaced from the churning water to witness her husband's destruction, her scream of anguish echoing across the valley as she watched the massive bear's jaws work with methodical efficiency. The water around them turned crimson as Robert's blood mixed with the mineral-rich springs, creating a horrific contrast between the peaceful setting and the brutal reality of predation. "Robert!" Jessica's voice cracked with desperate anguish as she lunged toward her husband, her rational mind completely overwhelmed by the need to somehow intervene in his destruction. The bear's massive head turned toward her movement, his jaws still locked around Robert's motionless form as his dark eyes assessed this new threat to his kill. Tom had managed to reach the edge of the hot springs pool during the initial chaos, his wilderness experience providing him with the presence of mind to seek safety rather than attempting futile heroics. "Everyone out of the water now!" he shouted, his voice carrying desperate urgency as he realized their only chance for survival lay in immediate retreat from the death trap the springs had become. Marcus was already moving toward the pool's edge, his survival instincts overriding his concern for Robert as he struggled through the churning water toward relative safety. Sarah followed close behind him, her face white with shock and terror as she witnessed violence beyond anything her civilized upbringing had prepared her to process. The massive bear released Robert's lifeless body and turned his attention toward Jessica, who remained in the water despite Tom's urgent commands to retreat. Her anguish and desperation had overridden her survival instincts, leaving her vulnerable to the predator who now focused his killing fury entirely upon her. Jessica felt the bear's massive paw strike her back with bone-crushing force, the impact driving her face first into the rocky bottom of the hot springs pool. The mineral deposits that lined the thermal feature tore deep gashes in her face and arms as she was ground against them by the enormous predator's overwhelming strength. The warm water that had seemed so healing now stung her wounds with acidic intensity. The bear's massive jaws closed around Jessica's left shoulder and arm, his incredible bite force crushing bone and tearing muscle as he attempted to drag her from the water like a salmon. Her screams of agony echoed across the wilderness as teeth designed for killing moose and caribou worked with methodical efficiency on her human form. Tom had reached his bear spray and was struggling with the safety mechanism, his hands shaking with adrenaline and terror as he attempted to deploy their only effective weapon against the massive predator. The aerosol canister that had seemed so reassuring during their safety briefing now felt inadequate against 800 pounds of killing fury that was systematically destroying his friends. The oleoresin capsicum spray finally discharged in a powerful stream that caught the massive bear directly in his face and eyes, the potent chemical irritant, causing him to release Jessica and rear back with a roar of pain and fury that shook the entire valley. His massive paws clawed at his burning eyes as he temporarily retreated from his assault on the helpless humans. Jessica collapsed in the bloody water of the hot springs, her left arm hanging at an impossible angle as bone fragments protruded through torn muscle and skin. The bear's massive jaws had crushed her shoulder blade and severed major blood vessels, creating injuries that were bleeding profusely into the mineral-rich water that now resembled a scene from hell rather than a natural healing feature. "Get her out of there!" Tom shouted to Marcus and Sarah, who had reached the safety of dry land but remained paralyzed by the horrific scene playing out before them. "We have to stop the bleeding or she's going to die right here." The bear spray's effectiveness was temporary, and the massive predator was already beginning to recover from the chemical assault on his eyes and respiratory system. His roars of pain and fury echoed across the wilderness as he shook his enormous head and pawed at his burning face. The intelligence in his dark eyes was now completely overwhelmed by rage and killing instinct. Marcus plunged back into the bloody water of the hot springs to reach Jessica, his scientific training overriding his terror as he assessed her injuries and began the desperate process of trying to extract her from the death trap the pool had become. Her shoulder and arm were mangled beyond recognition, bone and muscle exposed in wounds that were bleeding at a rate that indicated major arterial damage. "She's going into shock," Marcus announced, his voice tight with professional assessment even as his hands shook with the adrenaline that flooded his system. "We need to get pressure on these wounds immediately, or she's going to bleed out before we can get her to medical attention." The massive bear had recovered enough from the bear spray to resume his attack, his enormous bulk moving with renewed purpose toward the humans who had invaded his territory and caused him pain. His massive paws left deep impressions in the soft earth around the hot springs as he approached the group with obvious killing intent. Tom discharged another burst of bear spray, this time creating a defensive barrier between the predator and the injured humans. The chemical cloud hung in the still air like a wall of invisible fire, causing the enormous bear to pause and reassess his approach. His massive head swung back and forth as he tested the air, seeking a path through the irritating chemicals to reach his intended victims. "We need to get to the emergency beacon," Tom shouted over Jessica's screams of agony as Marcus and Sarah worked desperately to control her bleeding. This is way beyond anything we can handle with our medical supplies. Sarah had torn her shirt into strips and was applying pressure to the worst of Jessica's wounds, her hands quickly becoming covered with blood as she struggled to slow the massive hemorrhaging. "The bleeding isn't stopping," she reported, her voice tight with fear as she realized the severity of the injuries they were attempting to treat. The satellite emergency beacon that could summon rescue helicopter was located back at their base camp, nearly 50 yards away, through terrain that the massive bear now controlled. Reaching the device would require someone to sprint across open ground, while the enormous predator remained focused on destroying anything that moved within his territory. Jake had been filming the entire horrific encounter from his position near the edge of the clearing, his camera equipment automatically documenting the most terrifying wildlife attack ever recorded in Alaska. His hands shook as he struggled to maintain focus on the scene while simultaneously trying to identify options for escape or rescue. "I can reach the beacon," Jake announced, his voice carrying more confidence than he actually felt as he assessed the distance between his position and their base camp. "If I can create enough distraction to draw the bear's attention, someone else might be able to help Jessica while I activate the emergency signal." The massive brown bear had begun testing the edges of the bear spray cloud, his enormous bulk moving with surprising stealth as he sought a way around the chemical barrier that protected his intended victims. His dark eyes remained focused on the humans with unmistakable killing intent, while his massive jaws worked constantly as if anticipating the taste of flesh and bone. "Nobody else moves until that bear decides to leave," Tom commanded, his extensive experience in dangerous wildlife encounters providing the only authoritative voice in their desperate situation. "Our only chance is to wait him out and hope he eventually loses interest and moves on to other territory." Jessica's consciousness was beginning to fade as blood loss and shock overwhelmed her system. Her body's attempt to preserve vital functions by shutting down non-essential processes. Her breathing became increasingly shallow and rapid as her cardiovascular system struggled to maintain adequate circulation with massive ongoing hemorrhaging from her mangled shoulder and arm. "She's dying," Marcus announced with clinical precision, his medical training allowing him to assess Jessica's condition even as his emotional state bordered on complete breakdown. "Without immediate surgical intervention and blood transfusion, she's not going to survive the next 30 minutes. The reality of their situation struck the group like a physical blow as they realized that Jessica was bleeding to death in their arms, while a massive predator prevented any possibility of reaching help. The satellite emergency beacon that could summon rescue helicopter remained tantalizingly close, but completely inaccessible as long as the enormous bear maintained his aggressive posture. Robert's lifeless body floated face down in the hot springs pool, his blood continuing to leach into the mineral-rich water that had once seemed so therapeutic and healing. The contrast between the peaceful setting and the brutal reality of his death created a surreal nightmare that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The massive bear had found a way around the dissipating bear spray cloud and was approaching their position with renewed determination. His enormous paws made no sound as he moved across the soft earth, his predatory instincts guiding him toward the wounded prey that his enhanced senses told him was weakening rapidly. Tom prepared to discharge the last of his bear spray, knowing that once the chemical deterrent was exhausted, they would have no defense against 800 pounds of predatory fury. His hands remained steady despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm his rational mind, his years of wilderness experience providing the discipline necessary to function under extreme stress. "When I give the signal, everyone run for the trees," Tom instructed, his voice carrying grim authority as he prepared for what might be their final desperate gambit for survival. "Don't look back. Don't try to help anyone who falls behind. Just run as fast as you can, and don't stop until you reach thick cover." The massive brown bear's final charge came without warning, his enormous bulk accelerating with shocking speed across the remaining distance that separated him from his intended victims. His massive jaws gaped open to reveal teeth designed for tearing flesh, while his dark eyes blazed with predatory fury that had been intensified by the pain and humiliation of the bear spray attacks. Tom's final burst of chemical deterrent caught the charging bear directly in his open mouth and nostrils, the potent oleoresin capsicum flooding his respiratory system with fire that caused him to stumble and crash into the rocky edge of the hot springs pool. His roars of pain and fury shook the entire valley as he thrashed wildly in the shallow water, temporarily blinded and disoriented by the chemical assault. "Run now!" Tom shouted, grabbing Jessica's unconscious form and attempting to carry her toward the tree line, while Marcus and Sarah fled in opposite directions. The weight of the injured woman made his movement impossibly slow compared to the speed that survival demanded, but his wilderness code prevented him from abandoning a victim to save himself. The massive predator recovered from the bear spray attack with frightening speed, his enormous head clearing as rage overcame the chemical irritation that had temporarily disabled him. His dark eyes locked onto Tom's struggling form as the guide attempted to carry Jessica to safety, and his massive bulk began moving with renewed purpose toward this final group of victims. Jake had reached the emergency beacon and was frantically working to activate the device, his hands shaking with adrenaline as he struggled to remember the proper sequence of commands that would summon rescue assistance. The satellite communication system seemed to take forever to establish connection, each second stretching into eternity as he listened to the sounds of continuing violence from the hot springs area. The massive bear's massive jaws closed around Tom's leg with crushing force, the enormous predator's bite easily shattering bone as he dragged the experienced guide away from Jessica's unconscious form. Tom's scream of agony echoed across the wilderness as teeth designed for killing moose worked with methodical efficiency on his human body. Marcus had reached the relative safety of the tree line, but could hear Jessica's labored breathing growing weaker as she lost consciousness completely. Her injuries were bleeding profusely, despite Sarah's desperate attempts to apply pressure, and it was becoming obvious that she would not survive much longer without immediate medical intervention. The emergency beacon finally established satellite connection, its automated distress signal beginning the process of summoning rescue helicopters that were still hours away from their remote location. Jake's voice cracked with emotion as he provided coordinates and urgent medical information to the rescue coordinator, knowing that help would arrive far too late to save the victims who were dying around him. The massive brown bear had killed Tom with the same methodical efficiency he had used on Robert, his enormous jaws crushing vital organs as the experienced guide's struggles gradually weakened and ceased. The predator's dark eyes remained focused and intelligent, even as he committed acts of incredible violence, his behavior consistent with a territorial male defending resources from perceived threats. Sarah had managed to reach Jessica's unconscious form and was continuing her desperate attempts to control the massive bleeding, but her limited medical training was clearly inadequate for injuries of this severity. The makeshift bandages she had created from torn clothing were becoming saturated with blood faster than she could replace them, indicating that major arteries had been severed. "The helicopter is coming!" Jake shouted from his position near the emergency beacon, though his voice carried more desperation than hope as he realized the time factor involved. ETA is 45 minutes, but they're launching immediately with emergency medical personnel. Jessica's breathing became increasingly shallow and irregular as her body's compensatory mechanisms began failing under the stress of massive blood loss. Her skin had taken on the pale, clammy appearance that indicated advanced shock, while her pulse became rapid and thready as her cardiovascular system struggled to maintain adequate circulation. The massive bear had begun feeding on Tom's remains with the casual efficiency of an apex predator consuming his kill. The sounds of tearing flesh and crushing bone created a horrific soundtrack to Jessica's dying moments, while Robert's lifeless body continued floating in the blood-stained water of the hot springs that had been their final destination. Marcus emerged from the tree line with a desperate plan, having located a large branch that might serve as a weapon against the enormous predator. His scientific training had been overwhelmed by primitive survival instincts as he prepared to risk his own life in a probably futile attempt to drive the bear away from Jessica's location. "Don't do it," Sarah shouted, recognizing the suicidal nature of Marcus's intended intervention. "There's nothing you can do against that animal except get yourself killed. Jessica needs us to stay alive so we can guide the rescue team to her location." The massive brown bear looked up from his feeding as Marcus approached, his enormous head tilting slightly as he assessed this new potential threat to his kill. Blood dripped from his massive jaws as he studied the approaching human, his dark eyes calculating whether this small creature posed enough danger to warrant defensive action. Jessica's consciousness flickered briefly as her body made one final attempt to maintain vital functions, her emerald eyes opening just long enough to see the blood-stained horror that the peaceful hot springs had become. Her last coherent thought was of Robert floating motionless in the mineral-rich water that had once promised healing and renewal. The rescue helicopter's rotors became audible in the distance as the aircraft approached their remote location, but the sound seemed impossibly faint compared to the immediate reality of death and violence that surrounded the survivors. The medical personnel aboard the aircraft were equipped with trauma supplies and emergency surgical capabilities, but they would need living patients to treat upon their arrival. Marcus charged the massive bear with his improvised weapon, his academic background providing no preparation for close combat with 800 pounds of predatory muscle. The enormous animal rose onto his hind legs to meet this threat, his full 9-foot height creating an image of raw power that belonged more to nightmares than to waking reality. The bear's massive paw struck Marcus with crushing force, the impact hurling him backward into the rocky edge of the hot springs pool with bone-breaking violence. His skull cracked against the mineral deposits with a sound like breaking pottery, and his body collapsed into the blood-stained water with lifeless finality. Sarah found herself alone with Jessica's dying form as the massive predator returned to his feeding. The bear's attention focused on the fresh kill that Marcus had provided through his heroic but futile intervention. The helicopter's approach was becoming more audible, but Jessica's breathing had become so shallow and irregular that it seemed unlikely she would survive the remaining minutes until help arrived. Jake remained frozen near the emergency beacon, his camera equipment continuing to document the horrific scene, even as his conscious mind struggled to process the reality of watching his friends die one by one. The footage he was capturing would eventually provide law enforcement with detailed evidence of the attack, but that future consideration seemed meaningless in the face of immediate tragedy. The massive brown bear looked up from his feeding as the rescue helicopter became visible through the trees, his enormous head turning toward the approaching aircraft with obvious curiosity and growing agitation. The sound of rotors and mechanical engine noise represented something outside his experience, and his posture shifted from feeding behavior to defensive alertness. Jessica's breathing stopped completely as her cardiovascular system finally succumbed to massive blood loss, her body's desperate fight for survival ending in the peaceful unconsciousness that preceded death. Her emerald eyes remained open, but unseeing, as her life ebbed away in the blood-stained water of the hot springs that had been intended as a romantic retreat. The rescue helicopter landed in the nearest suitable clearing, its medical personnel immediately beginning the process of assessing casualties and providing emergency treatment. Their advanced trauma training and sophisticated equipment represented the pinnacle of emergency medical care, but they had arrived too late to save any of the victims, except possibly Jessica. Sarah waved frantically toward the helicopter crew while maintaining pressure on Jessica's wounds, her voice hoarse from screaming as she tried to communicate the urgency of the medical situation. "She's still breathing!" she shouted, though Jessica's vital signs were so weak as to be barely detectable. The massive bear had retreated into the forest at the approach of the helicopter, his feeding interrupted by the mechanical sounds and human activity that represented potential threats to his kills. His enormous bulk disappeared into the heavy vegetation with surprising speed and stealth, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would haunt the survivors and rescue personnel for years to come. Emergency medical technicians reached Jessica's location within minutes of the helicopter's landing, their assessment revealing the severity of her injuries and the advanced state of shock that threatened her remaining chances for survival. Their immediate priorities focused on establishing intravenous access, controlling bleeding, and stabilizing her condition for emergency transport to trauma facilities. "We've got a weak pulse and extremely low blood pressure," the lead paramedic announced as his team worked with practiced efficiency to prepare Jessica for transport. "Massive blood loss, probable arterial damage, and she's in severe hypovolemic shock. We need to get her to a trauma center immediately." The helicopter's medical bay had been configured for emergency surgery, allowing the flight crew to begin advanced life support procedures during transport to the nearest hospital equipped to handle trauma cases. Jessica's condition remained critical as they loaded her onto the aircraft, her survival dependent on the medical team's ability to maintain her vital signs during the flight to Fairbanks. Jake and Sarah climbed aboard the rescue helicopter as the sole survivors of an expedition that had begun with such promise and scientific enthusiasm. Their faces reflected the psychological trauma of witnessing their friends' deaths, while their hands shook with adrenaline and delayed shock reaction. The helicopter lifted off from the blood-stained clearing, leaving behind the bodies of Robert, Tom, and Marcus in the wilderness that had transformed from paradise to hell in a matter of minutes. The hot springs that had been their intended destination continued steaming peacefully in the morning air, their mineral-rich waters now forever associated with violence and death rather than healing and renewal. Alaska State Troopers were already mobilizing a recovery team to secure the scene and retrieve the victims' remains, while wildlife officials prepared to track and evaluate the massive brown bear responsible for the attack. The predator's aggressive territorial behavior suggested possible habituation to human presence, creating public safety concerns that would require immediate investigation and potential intervention. Jessica clung to life during the helicopter flight to Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, the medical team's sophisticated life support equipment maintaining her vital signs as trauma surgeons prepared to receive the most severely injured bear attack survivor in Alaska's recorded history. Her chances for survival remained uncertain as the aircraft raced across the wilderness toward the medical facilities that represented her only hope for living through the morning's horror. The news media had already begun responding to initial reports of a mass casualty bear attack in Alaska's interior, with helicopter crews and reporters converging on the area to document what was shaping up to be one of the most severe wildlife incidents in the state's history. The combination of multiple fatalities and a sole survivor with life-threatening injuries guaranteed intense public attention and demands for immediate action. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the chief trauma surgeon at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, assembled her emergency response team as the helicopter approached with Jessica's critical injuries. Her 23 years of experience treating wilderness trauma cases had provided her with extensive knowledge of bear attack injuries, but the preliminary reports suggested wounds that would challenge even her considerable expertise. "We're dealing with massive tissue destruction, possible arterial transection, and severe blood loss," Dr. Morrison announced to her surgical team as they prepared the operating room for emergency intervention. "The patient has been in shock for over an hour, so we're looking at a very narrow window for successful treatment." The helicopter's landing at the hospital triggered a carefully choreographed response that had been practiced countless times but rarely implemented under such extreme circumstances. Jessica was rushed directly into surgery as the trauma team worked to assess the full extent of her injuries and begin the complex process of reconstruction that would determine whether she would survive the day. Jake and Sarah were immediately separated for detailed interviews with Alaska state troopers, their eyewitness accounts providing crucial information for the investigation into the attack and the recovery operations that were already being planned. Their psychological state required careful handling by experienced law enforcement personnel who understood the impact of witnessing extreme violence. The bear was enormous, Sarah told investigators, her voice shaking as she recalled the terrifying encounter. "At least 8 feet tall when it stood up, maybe 9 feet. It moved so fast that none of us had time to react before it was in the water with us." Jake's video footage provided unprecedented documentation of a brown bear attack, capturing every detail of the violence with graphic clarity that would prove invaluable for wildlife research while simultaneously creating evidence that was almost too disturbing to review. His camera equipment had continued recording throughout the entire encounter, preserving a complete record of events from the initial approach through the final helicopter evacuation. Back at the hot springs, the massive brown bear had returned to the scene after the helicopter's departure, his territorial instincts drawing him back to investigate the disturbance and reclaim his kills. The bodies of Robert, Tom, and Marcus lay where they had fallen, their remains providing the predator with abundant food that would likely keep him in the immediate area for several days. Wildlife biologist Dr. Amanda Foster was already en route to the scene with a specialized team equipped to track and evaluate the bear responsible for the attack. Her expertise in dangerous wildlife situations would be crucial for determining whether the animal posed an ongoing threat to public safety and what measures might be necessary to prevent future incidents. Based on the preliminary reports, we're dealing with a mature male brown bear that's demonstrating highly aggressive territorial behavior, Dr. Foster explained to the assembled response team. The fact that he initiated an unprovoked attack on humans in a remote location suggests either habituation to human presence or possible food conditioning that's modified his natural behavior patterns. The investigation into the attack would ultimately focus on several key factors: the bear's previous exposure to humans, possible food sources that might have attracted him to the area, and environmental conditions that could have influenced his aggressive response to the research team's presence. The answers to these questions would determine both the immediate response and long-term management strategies for the area. In the operating room at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, Dr. Morrison and her team worked frantically to save Jessica's life as the full extent of her injuries became apparent under surgical examination. The bear's massive jaws had crushed her shoulder blade into multiple fragments, severed major blood vessels, and created tissue damage that extended far beyond the obvious external wounds. "We're looking at complete reconstruction of the shoulder joint," Dr. Morrison announced as she assessed the surgical challenges they faced. "The humeral head is completely shattered, The scapula is fractured in multiple places, and we have extensive soft tissue damage that's going to require multiple procedures to repair. Jessica's blood pressure remained critically low despite massive transfusion efforts, her body's shock response threatening to overwhelm the medical team's attempts to stabilize her condition. The combination of blood loss, tissue trauma, and psychological stress had pushed her physiological systems to the absolute limits of survival. "She's going into cardiac arrest," announced the anesthesiologist as Jessica's heart rhythm became increasingly erratic on the monitoring equipment, starting CPR and preparing defibrillation. The next 20 minutes would determine whether Jessica survived to tell her story or became the fourth fatality in what was already being called the deadliest bear attack in Alaska's modern history. Dr. Morrison's surgical skills, combined with the sophisticated life support equipment available at the trauma center, represented Jessica's only chance for surviving the massive injuries she had sustained. Emergency resuscitation efforts succeeded in restoring Jessica's cardiac rhythm, allowing the surgical team to continue their desperate attempts to repair the devastating damage caused by the massive bear's jaws. Her vital signs remained unstable throughout the procedure, requiring constant adjustment of medications and life support interventions. Back in the wilderness, Alaska State Troopers had reached the attack scene and were conducting the grim process of documenting the evidence and recovering the victims' remains. The peaceful hot springs had been transformed into a crime scene that told the story of humanity's vulnerability when faced with nature's most powerful predators. Trooper Captain James Wheeler, a 30-year veteran of wilderness investigations, surveyed the blood-stained scene with professional detachment despite the horrific nature of what had occurred. "This is the worst bear attack I've seen in 3 decades of working these cases," he observed, his voice carrying the weight of extensive experience with wildlife fatalities. The bear's massive paw prints in the soft earth around the hot springs provided clear evidence of the animal's enormous size, while claw marks on nearby trees indicated territorial marking behavior that suggested the predator considered this area part of his established range. The evidence painted a picture of a dominant male brown bear defending what he perceived as his territory against human intrusion. Wildlife officials had already begun planning the complex operation required to track and capture the bear responsible for the attack, knowing that public safety demanded immediate action to prevent additional incidents. The animal's aggressive behavior toward humans represented a clear threat that could not be ignored, regardless of the circumstances that had triggered the initial confrontation. "We're dealing with an apex predator that's demonstrated willingness to attack humans without provocation," explained Alaska Department of Fish and Game Enforcement Officer Captain Sarah Chen. "The size and behavior patterns described by the survivors indicate an animal that poses extreme danger to anyone who enters this area." The decision to pursue and destroy the bear would ultimately depend on the investigation's findings regarding his previous behavior and the specific circumstances that had led to the attack. Wildlife officials balanced public safety concerns against conservation principles that recognize the important role of large predators in maintaining ecosystem health. In the surgical suite at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, Jessica's condition remained critical as Dr. Morrison completed the complex reconstruction of her shattered shoulder joint. The procedure had required more than 6 hours of intensive surgery, with multiple specialists contributing their expertise to the effort to save her life and preserve function in her mangled arm. "We've managed to stabilize the major blood vessels and reconstruct the bone structure," Dr. Morrison announced to the waiting investigators and media representatives. "However, the patient remains in critical condition with a guarded prognosis. The next 48 hours will be crucial for determining her chances for full recovery." Jessica's survival represented both a medical miracle and a testament to the skill of the trauma team that had worked tirelessly to preserve her life. Her injuries would require months of additional surgery and rehabilitation, but she had defied the odds by surviving the initial attack and the complex medical interventions that followed. The story of the Chena Hot Springs bear attack would ultimately become one of the most documented and analyzed wildlife incidents in Alaska's history, with implications for wilderness safety protocols, bear management policies, and public understanding of human-wildlife interactions in remote areas. The tragic loss of Robert, Tom, and Marcus, combined with Jessica's miraculous survival, created a narrative that would influence how people approached wilderness recreation for years to come. News coverage of the attack spread rapidly across national and international media outlets, with graphic details and dramatic rescue footage capturing public attention in ways that highlighted both the beauty and danger of Alaska's pristine wilderness areas. The story resonated with audiences who lived safely removed from such primal encounters with nature's power. Jake's video documentation of the attack provided researchers with unprecedented insight into brown bear behavior during aggressive encounters, contributing valuable data to scientific understanding of predator psychology and attack patterns. However, the graphic nature of the footage also raised ethical questions about public access to such disturbing content. Wildlife biologist Dr. Amanda Foster reached the attack scene as evening approached, her tracking team immediately beginning the process of locating and evaluating the massive bear responsible for the morning's violence. Fresh tracks and sign indicated that the animal remained in the immediate area, probably defending his kills against scavengers. The bear's behavior suggests a mature male defending established territory, Dr. Foster observed as she examined the evidence. The unprovoked nature of the attack, combined with his size and aggressive response, indicates an animal that's reached full maturity and dominance in this ecosystem. The tracking operation would continue through the night, with specialized personnel using thermal imaging equipment and trained tracking dogs to locate the massive predator in the dense forest surrounding the hot springs. The bear's capture or destruction remained the primary objective, with public safety taking precedence over conservation concerns. In the intensive care unit at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, Jessica drifted in and out of consciousness as her body began the long, healing process that would ultimately determine her quality of life. The physical trauma of her injuries was compounded by the psychological impact of witnessing her husband's death and the destruction of their research team. Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's chief psychiatrist, had been called in to evaluate Jessica's mental state and begin the process of helping her cope with the traumatic memories that would haunt her recovery. The combination of survivor guilt, grief, and post-traumatic stress would require specialized treatment to prevent long-term psychological damage. Survivors of extreme wildlife attacks often experience unique forms of trauma that combine physical pain with profound psychological disruption, Dr. Williams explained to Jessica's medical team. The recovery process will require careful coordination between physical rehabilitation and mental health support. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding the attack continued as Alaska State Troopers interviewed witnesses, examined equipment, and reconstructed the sequence of events that had led to the tragedy. Their findings would ultimately influence safety recommendations for future wilderness expeditions and bear management policies throughout the state. Preliminary evidence suggested that the research team had followed established safety protocols and had not engaged in any behaviors that would typically trigger aggressive responses from brown bears. The attack appeared to represent an encounter with an unusually aggressive individual whose territorial instincts had been triggered by human presence in his established range. This incident highlights the inherent risks involved in wilderness research, particularly in areas that support large predator populations, observed Alaska Department of Fish and Game Commissioner Robert Anderson. Even experienced professionals following proper safety protocols can find themselves in situations where wildlife behavior exceeds normal parameters. The massive brown bear remained at large in the wilderness surrounding the attack site, his presence confirmed by fresh tracks and continued feeding activity at the location where the victims' bodies had been recovered. Wildlife officials maintained continuous surveillance of the area while preparing specialized equipment for the dangerous operation required to capture or destroy such a formidable predator. Public reaction to the attack ranged from calls for increased bear hunting quotas to demands for enhanced wilderness safety education, reflecting the complex emotions that such incidents triggered in communities that lived in close proximity to large predators. The tragedy served as a stark reminder of humanity's vulnerable position in ecosystems dominated by creatures that remained largely unchanged since prehistoric times. Environmental groups expressed concern that public reaction to the attack might lead to unnecessary persecution of brown bear populations that played crucial roles in maintaining ecosystem balance throughout Alaska. They emphasized the rarity of such incidents and the importance of understanding the specific circumstances that had triggered this particular encounter. Brown bears are generally shy animals that avoid human contact whenever possible, explained Alaska Wildlife Alliance spokesperson Dr. Michael Thompson. This incident appears to represent an anomaly rather than typical behavior, and we must be careful not to allow fear to drive policies that could harm important predator populations. The debate over appropriate responses to the attack would continue for months as various stakeholders attempted to balance public safety concerns with conservation objectives. The tragedy highlighted the ongoing challenges of managing human-wildlife interactions in areas where both species competed for access to limited resources. Jessica's medical condition gradually stabilized over the following days, though her injuries would require multiple additional surgeries and extensive rehabilitation to restore even partial function to her damaged arm and shoulder. The psychological trauma of her experience would prove even more challenging to treat than her physical wounds. The first time Jessica regained full consciousness, nearly a week after the attack, her immediate reaction was to ask about Robert's condition. The medical team had prepared for this moment, but delivering news of her husband's death while she was still recovering from life-threatening injuries required exceptional sensitivity and care. "I'm so sorry, Jessica," Dr. Morrison said gently, her voice carrying the weight of delivering devastating news to someone who had already endured unimaginable trauma. "Robert didn't survive the attack. Neither did Tom or Marcus. You and the other 2 members of your team are the only survivors." The news of her husband's death hit Jessica with force that seemed to cause more pain than her physical injuries, her grief manifesting in wails of anguish that echoed through the intensive care unit. The medical team had anticipated this reaction and was prepared with appropriate sedation and psychological support to help her through the initial shock. Dr. Williams worked closely with Jessica during the difficult days that followed, helping her process the complex emotions of survival, grief, and trauma that threatened to overwhelm her psychological defenses. The combination of losing her life partner and witnessing such extreme violence created a mental health challenge that would require years of treatment. Survivor guilt is one of the most difficult aspects of recovering from incidents like this, Dr. Williams explained to Jessica's family members who had traveled to Alaska to support her recovery. She's struggling with questions about why she survived when others didn't, and those feelings are completely normal but extremely painful to work through. The massive brown bear that had killed 3 people and nearly claimed Jessica's life remained at large, despite intensive tracking efforts by wildlife officials and law enforcement personnel. His intimate knowledge of the terrain and natural wariness of human activity made him extremely difficult to locate, even with sophisticated tracking equipment and trained dogs. Dr. Foster's team had identified several locations where the bear had been feeding and resting, but the animal's movements suggested intelligence and caution that made direct confrontation extremely dangerous. The decision was made to use bait stations and trap systems rather than pursuing him directly through dense forest, where he held every advantage. "We're dealing with an apex predator that's demonstrated both intelligence and extreme aggression," Dr. Foster explained to the assembled tracking team. "Direct pursuit in heavy cover would put our personnel at unacceptable risk, so we're implementing containment strategies designed to control his movement and create opportunities for safe capture." The international media attention surrounding the attack had created intense pressure for quick resolution, with news crews and documentary teams converging on the area to cover the ongoing search for the killer bear. The presence of media personnel complicated the tracking operation by creating additional safety concerns and potential interference with wildlife behavior. Local residents expressed growing concern about the continued presence of the aggressive bear in an area that was popular with hunters, hikers, and outdoor enthusiasts. Several businesses that depended on wilderness tourism reported cancellations as potential visitors decided to avoid the region until the dangerous animal was captured or destroyed. "People are scared, and rightfully so," explained local outfitter and guide service owner Mark Peterson. "When you have a bear that's willing to attack humans without provocation, it changes the whole dynamic of wilderness safety in this area. Nobody wants to take their family camping or hunting when there's a killer bear on the loose." The economic impact of the attack extended beyond immediate tourism losses to include increased insurance costs for wilderness guide services and potential liability issues for land management agencies. The incident highlighted the complex financial implications of human-wildlife conflicts in areas where outdoor recreation represented significant economic activity. Jessica's physical recovery progressed slowly but steadily as her medical team worked to restore function to her damaged arm and shoulder. Multiple surgical procedures were required to reconstruct the bone structure and repair the extensive soft tissue damage caused by the bear's massive jaws, but her youth and overall health supported the healing process. The psychological aspects of her recovery proved more challenging than the physical rehabilitation, with nightmares and flashbacks disrupting her sleep and creating anxiety that interfered with her participation in therapy sessions. Dr. Williams adjusted her treatment approach to address the unique combination of grief, trauma, and survivor guilt that characterized Jessica's mental state. "The dreams are the worst part," Jessica confided during one of her therapy sessions, her voice barely audible as she described the recurring nightmares that plagued her attempts to rest. "I keep seeing Robert's face when the bear grabbed him, and I wake up screaming because I couldn't save him." Support from family members and colleagues provided crucial emotional anchoring during Jessica's darkest moments, though their own grief over the loss of Robert, Tom, and Marcus complicated their ability to offer effective comfort. The entire research community had been shaken by the tragedy, with many questioning their own commitment to fieldwork in dangerous environments. Professional counseling services were made available to all members of the research teams that had worked with the victims, recognizing that the psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond the direct survivors. Universities and research institutions implemented new safety protocols and support systems designed to address the mental health aspects of wilderness research activities. 3 weeks after the attack, wildlife officials finally succeeded in locating and destroying the massive brown bear responsible for the killings. The animal was found at a bait station that had been established near the original attack site, his continued presence in the area confirming his territorial attachment to the hot springs location. The bear weighed 847 pounds and stood 8 feet 11 inches tall, reported Captain Chen as she announced the successful conclusion of the tracking operation. Examination of his remains confirmed that he was a mature male in prime physical condition, with no obvious injuries or diseases that might have explained his aggressive behavior. The bear's destruction brought mixed emotions to those who had been following the story, with relief over improved public safety tempered by sadness over the loss of such a magnificent predator. Wildlife officials emphasized that the decision had been necessary to prevent additional attacks, but they also acknowledged the tragedy of losing an apex predator that had been fulfilling his natural role in the ecosystem. Necropsy examination of the bear's remains provided valuable scientific data about brown bear physiology and behavior, while also confirming that the animal had indeed been feeding on human remains following the attack. The findings supported the decision to destroy the bear, while also contributing to research that might help prevent similar incidents in the future. The necropsy confirmed that this was an exceptionally large and powerful individual, even by brown bear standards, Dr. Foster explained in her official report. His physical condition indicated a successful and dominant animal that had been thriving in this ecosystem, which makes his aggressive behavior toward humans all the more unusual and concerning. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding the attack concluded that the research team had followed appropriate safety protocols and had not engaged in any behaviors that would typically trigger aggressive responses from brown bears. The incident was classified as an unprovoked attack by an unusually aggressive individual, highlighting the inherent risks of conducting research in areas inhabited by large predators. Jessica's recovery continued slowly through the summer months, with her physical condition improving steadily while her psychological healing remained complicated by grief and trauma. The loss of Robert created a void in her life that extended far beyond personal relationships to include their shared professional goals and research interests. "Everything reminds me of him," Jessica told Dr. Williams during one of their sessions, her voice filled with the deep sadness that had become her constant companion. "We had planned to spend our whole careers working together, exploring these incredible places and contributing to scientific understanding of wilderness ecosystems. Now I don't know if I can ever go back to that kind of work." The question of whether Jessica would return to wilderness research remained open as she focused on the immediate challenges of physical rehabilitation and emotional healing. Her experience had provided her with unique insights into human-wildlife interactions, but it had also created trauma that might prevent her from pursuing fieldwork in remote locations. Legal proceedings related to the attack focused primarily on workers' compensation claims and insurance coverage for the victims' families, rather than criminal or civil liability issues. The fact that the incident had occurred during official research activities complicated the normal processes for determining responsibility and compensation. Workers' compensation attorneys worked to ensure that the families of Robert, Tom, and Marcus received appropriate benefits, while also addressing Jessica's ongoing medical expenses and disability claims. The complex nature of wilderness research employment created legal challenges that required specialized expertise to resolve. These cases involve unique circumstances that don't fit neatly into normal workers' compensation categories, explained attorney David Harrison, who represented several of the families. When someone is killed by a wild animal during official research activities, there are questions about liability, safety protocols, and appropriate compensation that require careful legal analysis. The University of Alaska system implemented comprehensive reviews of their wilderness research safety protocols, with particular attention to bear encounter procedures and emergency response capabilities. The tragedy had highlighted gaps in preparation and equipment that needed to be addressed to protect future research teams. Insurance companies also conducted their own investigations into the incident, seeking to understand the risk factors involved in wilderness research and adjust their coverage policies accordingly. The financial implications of the attack extended far beyond immediate medical and legal costs to include long-term impacts on research funding and institutional liability. Jessica's first public statement about the attack came nearly 6 months after the incident, when she felt emotionally stable enough to participate in a carefully controlled interview with Alaska Public Media. Her account provided the most detailed description of the attack from a survivor's perspective, offering insights that proved valuable for both scientific research and public education. People need to understand that this was not a normal bear encounter, Jessica emphasized during the interview, her voice carrying both sadness and determination. We followed all the safety protocols, carried appropriate deterrents, and had extensive experience in bear country. Sometimes wilderness activities involve risks that can't be completely eliminated, no matter how careful and prepared you are. Her statement helped counter some of the criticism that had emerged regarding the research team's safety procedures, while also emphasizing the inherent dangers involved in wilderness research activities. Jessica's credibility as both a survivor and a professional wildlife researcher gave her words particular weight in discussions about bear safety and risk management. The interview also provided Jessica with an opportunity to honor the memory of Robert, Tom, and Marcus, describing their contributions to wildlife research and their passion for understanding Alaska's ecosystems. Her emotional tribute to her lost colleagues and husband resonated with audiences and helped humanize the statistical reality of wildlife attack fatalities. Robert and I had spent 15 years working together in some of the most remote and dangerous places in Alaska, Jessica recalled, her voice breaking slightly as she described their shared adventures. He died doing what he loved, in a place that had brought us incredible joy and scientific discovery. I try to remember that rather than focusing on the violence of how he died. The first anniversary of the attack brought renewed media attention to the story, with documentaries and news features examining the incident's impact on wilderness safety policies and bear management practices throughout Alaska. Jessica declined most interview requests, preferring to focus on her continuing recovery and rehabilitation. Physical therapy had restored much of the function in Jessica's damaged arm, though permanent nerve damage and joint stiffness served as constant reminders of her traumatic experience. Her range of motion remained limited, and chronic pain issues affected her sleep and daily activities, despite ongoing medical treatment. The psychological aspects of her recovery showed more variable progress, with periods of relative stability interrupted by episodes of severe depression and anxiety that required adjustment of her medication and therapy approaches. Dr. Williams continued working with Jessica to develop coping strategies for managing her trauma symptoms. "Some days are better than others," Jessica admitted to her therapist during one of their sessions. "I've accepted that I'll probably never be completely free of the nightmares and flashbacks, but I'm learning how to function despite them. The key is not letting the trauma control my entire life." Professional colleagues from the research community maintained contact with Jessica throughout her recovery, offering both emotional support and potential opportunities for returning to scientific work when she felt ready. Many expressed hope that her unique experience and insights could contribute to improved safety protocols and bear behavior research. Jessica's survival and recovery represent an incredible triumph of human resilience, observed Dr. Patricia Chen, her former colleague at the University of Alaska. Her insights into bear behavior during aggressive encounters, combined with her technical expertise, could make valuable contributions to wildlife research if she chooses to return to the field. The question of whether Jessica would resume wilderness research remained unresolved as she approached the second anniversary of the attack. Her physical condition had improved enough to allow limited fieldwork, but the psychological challenges of returning to remote locations remained formidable obstacles to overcome. Support groups for trauma survivors provided Jessica with connections to others who had experienced life-threatening wildlife encounters, creating a community of understanding that proved valuable for her emotional healing. The shared experiences of survival and recovery helped normalize her ongoing struggles with anxiety and grief. Meeting other people who have been through similar experiences helped me realize that my reactions and feelings are normal responses to abnormal situations, Jessica explained to Dr. Williams. It's comforting to know that other survivors have found ways to rebuild their lives and find meaning after traumatic events. The Chena Hot Springs area remained closed to public access for more than a year following the attack, as wildlife officials conducted extensive studies of bear populations and behavior patterns in the region. When the area finally reopened, new safety protocols and warning systems had been implemented to reduce the risk of future incidents. Enhanced bear awareness education became mandatory for all visitors to the region, with detailed briefings about proper behavior in bear country and emergency response procedures. The tragic events of that August morning had transformed a remote wilderness area into a symbol of the ongoing challenges of managing human-wildlife interactions in Alaska. Memorial markers were eventually installed near the hot springs to honor the memory of Robert, Tom, and Marcus, creating a permanent reminder of their contributions to wilderness research and the ultimate sacrifice they made in pursuit of scientific knowledge. The simple bronze plaques bore their names and a brief inscription acknowledging their dedication to understanding Alaska's natural heritage. Jessica visited the memorial site for the first time 3 years after the attack, accompanied by family members and close friends who provided emotional support during the difficult pilgrimage. Standing beside the peaceful hot springs where her husband had died, she found a measure of closure that had eluded her throughout the long recovery process. Being here again helps me remember the beauty and wonder that brought us to this place, Jessica reflected as she stood beside Robert's memorial. The violence and tragedy were real, but so were the love and passion for discovery that motivated our research. I don't want the bear attack to erase the positive memories of all the incredible experiences we shared in places like this. The visit marked a turning point in Jessica's emotional healing, providing her with the strength to begin considering a return to scientific work that honored both her own survival and the memory of her lost colleagues. The decision would ultimately shape the remainder of her career and determine how she chose to use her traumatic experience to benefit others. 5 years after the attack, Jessica published a comprehensive memoir that detailed both her survival experience and her long journey toward recovery. Surviving the Springs, a story of love, loss, and healing in Alaska's wilderness, became a bestseller that raised awareness about wildlife safety while providing inspiration for other trauma survivors. The book's proceeds were donated to establish the Robert Lane Memorial Fund for Wilderness Research Safety, supporting the development of improved safety equipment and protocols for scientists working in remote locations. Jessica's decision to transform her traumatic experience into a force for positive change reflected her determination to honor her husband's memory through meaningful action. Writing the book forced me to confront every aspect of what happened that day, including details that I had tried to forget, Jessica explained during promotional interviews. But it also helped me understand that surviving such an experience carries with it a responsibility to use that survival for purposes that transcend personal healing. The memoir's detailed account of the attack provided researchers with valuable insights into bear behavior during aggressive encounters, while its description of the recovery process offered guidance for other trauma survivors facing similar challenges. Jessica's ability to maintain scientific objectivity while describing deeply personal experiences made the book particularly valuable for multiple audiences. Professional reviewers praised the work for its honest examination of both the physical and psychological impacts of wildlife trauma, noting Jessica's courage in sharing such intimate details of her suffering and healing process. The book's success exceeded all expectations, reaching audiences far beyond the typical readership for wilderness survival stories. 10 years after the attack, Jessica had established herself as a leading expert on wildlife safety and trauma recovery, consulting with research institutions and government agencies on protocols for managing human-wildlife interactions in remote locations. Her unique combination of technical expertise and personal experience made her an invaluable resource for organizations working to protect both humans and wildlife. The legacy of the Chena Hot Springs attack continued to influence wilderness safety policies throughout North America, with Jessica's recommendations being implemented by numerous agencies responsible for managing public access to areas inhabited by large predators. Her work had undoubtedly prevented additional tragedies by improving preparation and response procedures. I believe that Robert, Tom, and Marcus would be proud of how their deaths have contributed to protecting other researchers and wilderness enthusiasts, Jessica reflected during a speech commemorating the 10th anniversary of the attack. Their sacrifice was not chosen, but the positive changes that resulted from their loss represent a meaningful legacy that honors their memory. Jessica's personal life had also evolved significantly during the decade following the tragedy, as she gradually opened herself to new relationships while maintaining deep respect for Robert's memory. Her marriage to Dr. James Foster, a wildlife veterinarian who had supported her recovery, represented a new chapter that honored both her past and her future. The couple's decision to continue conducting wilderness research together, albeit with significantly enhanced safety protocols, demonstrated Jessica's remarkable resilience and her determination not to allow fear to completely eliminate her passion for scientific discovery. Their work focused on developing non-invasive research methods that minimized risks while still advancing understanding of wildlife behavior. "I will never again be the fearless researcher I was before the attack," Jessica acknowledged during interviews about her return to fieldwork. "But I've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to pursue important goals, despite legitimate concerns about potential risks." The Chena Hot Springs incident remained the deadliest bear attack in Alaska's modern history, serving as a sobering reminder of the inherent dangers involved in wilderness activities, while also highlighting the importance of proper preparation and response procedures. The lessons learned from that tragic August morning continued to save lives more than a decade later. Jessica's transformation from victim to advocate represented one of the most inspiring recovery stories in the annals of wildlife attack survival, demonstrating the human capacity for healing and growth even after experiencing unimaginable trauma. Her work ensured that the memory of Robert, Tom, and Marcus would continue to protect future generations of wilderness researchers and enthusiasts. The hot springs themselves were eventually reopened to public access, though new safety measures and educational programs ensured that visitors understood both the beauty and the potential dangers of Alaska's pristine wilderness areas. The memorial plaques remained as permanent reminders of the price that dedicated researchers had paid in pursuit of scientific knowledge. As Jessica approached the 15th anniversary of the attack, she reflected on the long journey that had transformed her from a grieving widow and trauma survivor into a respected authority on wildlife safety and human resilience. The path had been difficult beyond anything she could have imagined, but it had also revealed reserves of strength and purpose that she never knew she possessed. "The bear took everything I thought I knew about my life and my future," Jessica observed during a recent interview. "But somehow, in the process of rebuilding from that destruction, I discovered who I really was and what I was truly capable of achieving. I would never choose to experience such trauma again, but I'm grateful for the person it helped me become." The next story is Grizzly Destroys Police SUV, Kills Officer, January 17, 2025. The dashboard camera timestamp read 14:37:22 when Officer Kevin Morris first spotted the tracks. Fresh paw prints, each one larger than a dinner plate, pressed deep into the snow-covered gravel of Highway 35, just north of Kalispell, Montana. Kevin brought his Ford Explorer to a slow stop, the emergency lights casting alternating red and blue shadows across the stark January landscape. He'd been a Montana Highway Patrol officer for 14 years, and in that time he'd seen plenty of wildlife encounters. But something about these tracks made his stomach tighten with unease. Kevin Michael Morris was 38 years old, a man who'd found his calling in the vast wilderness of northwestern Montana. Born in Missoula to a family of loggers, he'd grown up understanding the raw power of nature and the thin line between civilization and the wild. His father, Dale Morris, had taught him to read animal signs before he could properly tie his shoes. His mother, Patricia, a former nurse at Kalispell Regional Medical Center, had instilled in him the importance of helping others, no matter the cost. These lessons had shaped Kevin into the kind of officer who volunteered for the most remote patrols, the ones that took him deep into grizzly country where cell service was spotty and backup could be hours away. The tracks were fresh, maybe an hour old, heading northeast toward the dense timber that bordered Glacier National Park. Kevin stepped out of his vehicle, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the -15-degree air. The snow crunched under his boots as he knelt beside the largest print, using his tactical pen to measure the width. 12 inches across, claws extending another 4 inches beyond the pad. A mature male grizzly, probably weighing close to 700 pounds. The spacing between prints suggested the bear was moving with purpose, not the meandering gait of an animal simply foraging. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had warned all patrol units that morning about increased bear activity in the Flathead Valley. The unseasonably warm December had disrupted hibernation patterns, keeping several known problem bears active well past their normal denning time. Fish, wildlife and parks had issued multiple warnings, and there had been 3 livestock depredations in the past week alone. But this was different. These tracks were on the highway itself, and they were heading directly toward the residential areas that dotted the valley floor. Kevin activated his radio, the static crackling in the cold air. "Kalispell Dispatch. This is Unit 47. I've got fresh grizzly sign on Highway 35, approximately mile marker 12. Large, mature male, tracks heading northeast toward Whitefish Range." The voice of dispatcher Maria Santos crackled back through the radio. "Copy that, Unit 47. Fish and Wildlife has been notified. Are you requesting backup?" Kevin looked up at the grey sky, heavy with the promise of more snow. The Weather Service had issued a winter storm warning, with 6 to 8 inches expected before midnight. If this bear was looking for winter shelter, it would be increasingly desperate as the temperature dropped. Desperate bears made unpredictable decisions. Negative on backup for now, dispatch. I'm going to follow the tracks for a few hundred yards, see if I can determine direction of travel. Will advise. Roger, Unit 47. Be advised, GPS shows your location is approximately 2 miles from the Henderson property. They reported a missing calf yesterday. Kevin felt his jaw tighten. The Henderson Ranch was home to Tom and Ellen Henderson, a couple in their 70s who'd been ranching in the valley for over 40 years. Their grandson, 9-year-old Jacob Henderson, often stayed with them on weekends. The boy loved exploring the property on his small ATV, and Kevin had pulled him over more than once for riding too close to the highway without a helmet. The tracks led Kevin away from the highway, following an old logging road that wound through stands of Douglas fir and lodgepole pine. The snow was deeper here, and his boots broke through the crust with each step, sending small avalanches cascading down the embankment. The silence was absolute, except for the rhythmic crunch of his footsteps and the distant whisper of wind through the treetops. Kevin had been following the tracks for about 20 minutes when he noticed something that made him stop. The bear's gait had changed. The prints were closer together now, and there were scuff marks in the snow between them. The animal was moving more cautiously, as if it had detected something that demanded its attention. Kevin's hand instinctively moved to his sidearm, a Glock 22 loaded with .40 caliber rounds. He knew from his training that handgun rounds were largely ineffective against a charging grizzly, but the weight of the weapon was reassuring nonetheless. The radio crackled again. Unit 47, dispatch. Go ahead, dispatch. Fish and Wildlife Officer Rebecca Martinez is en route to your location, ETA 20 minutes. She's bringing tranquilizer equipment and wants to coordinate with you before proceeding. Copy that. I'll maintain visual on the tracks until she arrives. Officer Rebecca Martinez was one of the most experienced wildlife officers in the state, a woman who'd spent 15 years dealing with problem bears throughout Montana. Kevin had worked with her on several occasions and respected her judgment. If anyone could handle this situation safely, it would be Rebecca. The tracks led deeper into the timber, following a natural corridor between two steep ridges. Kevin could see where the bear had stopped to investigate an old stump, clawing deep gouges in the rotting wood. The scratches were fresh, wood chips scattered across the snow in a wide circle. Kevin knelt to examine them more closely and felt his blood chill. Mixed in with the wood chips were tufts of brown hair, and beneath them, dark stains that could only be blood. Kevin immediately switched his radio to the emergency channel. Dispatch, Unit 47. I need immediate backup at my location. I've got evidence of a fresh kill. Unit 47. Confirm you have located remains? Negative on human remains, but there's definite predation evidence. Large amount of blood, animal hair. Could be the Hendersons' missing calf. Copy, Unit 47. All available units are responding. Do not approach alone. But Kevin was already moving forward, following a clear drag trail that led away from the highway. The bear had pulled its kill deeper into the forest, seeking cover where it could feed undisturbed. Standard behavior for a grizzly, but it also meant the animal was likely still in the immediate area, protecting its food cache. The trail led to a small clearing surrounded by thick underbrush. Kevin could smell it before he saw it. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the musky odor of bear. In the center of the clearing lay the remains of what had once been a young Holstein calf, probably weighing around 300 pounds. The bear had been feeding recently. Steam still rose from the exposed meat in the frigid air. Kevin was backing away from the carcass when he heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through his chest. The sound of an angry grizzly is unlike anything else in nature, a deep bass note that triggers every primitive alarm system in the human brain. Kevin froze, his eyes scanning the tree line as he tried to locate the source. The bear emerged from the brush about 30 yards to his left, moving with the deceptive grace that makes grizzlies so dangerous. At 7 feet tall on its hind legs and weighing close to 800 pounds, the male grizzly was a prehistoric killing machine, perfectly adapted for survival in one of North America's harshest environments. Its winter coat was thick and dark, almost black in the fading afternoon light. But it was the bear's eyes that Kevin would remember in the final moments of his life. Small, dark, and completely without fear. Kevin's training took over. He began backing slowly toward his vehicle, avoiding direct eye contact while keeping the bear in his peripheral vision. Grizzlies can run up to 35 miles per hour, faster than any human could hope to achieve. But they typically won't charge unless they feel threatened or are protecting food or cubs. Kevin was hoping this bear would choose to return to its kill rather than pursue a potential threat. For a moment, it seemed like the bear might do exactly that. It dropped to all fours and swung its massive head toward the carcass, testing the air with its powerful sense of smell. Kevin continued his slow retreat, covering about 10 yards before the bear's attention snapped back to him. Something had changed in the animal's posture. Its hackles were up, and it had begun the side-to-side swaying motion that experienced guides know means an imminent charge. Kevin reached for his radio, never taking his eyes off the bear. "Dispatch, Unit 47. I have a hostile grizzly at my location, requesting immediate backup and fish and wildlife." The bear charged. 800 pounds of muscle and fury exploded across the clearing at a speed that Kevin's mind could barely process. He had time for one clear thought, that he was about to die, before his training kicked in and he drew his weapon. The Glock cleared the holster smoothly, muscle memory guiding his hands even as terror flooded his system with adrenaline. Kevin got off 3 shots before the bear hit him. The .40 caliber round struck the charging grizzly in the chest and shoulder, but rather than stopping the animal, they seemed only to enrage it further. Kevin's last coherent memory was of being lifted off his feet and thrown backward into a tree trunk with enough force to shatter 3 ribs and puncture his left lung. The attack lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds according to the dashboard camera in Kevin's patrol vehicle, which continued recording even as the bear dragged his body away from the tree where he'd landed. During those 4 minutes, the grizzly displayed the kind of sustained aggression that wildlife experts would later describe as highly unusual. Most bear attacks last less than 30 seconds before the animal withdraws, satisfied that the threat has been neutralized. This bear seemed intent on ensuring that Kevin Morris would never threaten its food source again. Emergency dispatch received Kevin's last transmission at 15:23 hours. When backup arrived at 15:47, they found his patrol vehicle with its driver's door open and engine still running. The dashboard camera had automatically stopped recording when the internal battery died, but not before capturing footage that would become evidence in what the media would later call the most documented bear attack in Montana history. Fish and Wildlife Officer Rebecca Martinez arrived at the scene at 16:15, just as the first snowflakes of the predicted storm began to fall. She found Kevin's radio lying in the snow about 20 feet from his vehicle, its casing cracked but still functional. The trail of blood and drag marks was clearly visible, leading away from the road into the dense timber. Rebecca was joined by Montana Highway Patrol Sergeant Mike Torres, a 20-year veteran who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning to Montana. Mike had seen combat casualties, but nothing had prepared him for the scene they discovered in the clearing, where Kevin had made his final stand. The evidence of the attack was spread across an area roughly 50 feet in diameter. Torn pieces of Kevin's uniform, scattered equipment, and blood splattered across the snow and trees in patterns that told the story of a violent struggle. Kevin's body was found approximately 100 yards from the initial attack site, partially buried under a pile of snow and debris that the bear had used to cache what it perceived as a food source. The grizzly had dragged him to a secluded spot beneath a large fallen log, behavior consistent with a bear protecting its kill from scavengers. Kevin was still alive when they found him, but barely. Dr. Amanda Reeves, the lead trauma surgeon at Kalispell Regional Medical Center, would later describe Kevin's injuries as the most severe bear mauling wounds she'd encountered in 15 years of emergency medicine. The bear's claws had left deep lacerations across his back and shoulders, while its teeth had inflicted devastating damage to his left arm and chest. Most critically, his skull had been fractured in 2 places, causing bleeding in his brain that would prove impossible to control. The rescue operation that followed Kevin's discovery involved over 30 personnel from multiple agencies: Montana Highway Patrol, Flathead County Sheriff's Department, Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and a specialized trauma team from Mercy Flight Air Ambulance Service. The falling snow complicated the evacuation, forcing rescuers to carry Kevin nearly a mile through increasingly difficult terrain to reach the nearest helicopter landing zone. Dr. Reeves and her team worked for over 6 hours to save Kevin's life, but the combination of massive blood loss, traumatic brain injury, and complications from hypothermia proved too much for even their considerable skills. Kevin Morris was pronounced dead at 23:47 hours on January 17, 2025, becoming the first law enforcement officer in Montana history to be killed in the line of duty by a grizzly bear. The bear that killed Kevin Morris was never found. In the days following the attack, a massive search effort involving over 50 personnel from Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the U.S. Forest Service, and local law enforcement agencies scoured nearly 200 square miles of wilderness looking for the animal. Using helicopters, tracking dogs, and motion-activated cameras, searchers found evidence of the bear's movements throughout the Whitefish Range. But the animal seemed to have vanished into the vast wilderness that bordered Glacier National Park. Wildlife biologist Dr. James Crawford, who led the search effort, theorized that the bear had likely denned for the winter in a remote location, possibly a natural cave high in the mountains where human access was limited. Grizzlies are capable of traveling enormous distances when motivated, and this particular animal had demonstrated both intelligence and adaptability in evading capture. The investigation into Kevin's death revealed several disturbing details about the bear's behavior leading up to the attack. Game cameras positioned throughout the valley showed the same animal had been active for over 2 weeks, moving primarily at night and avoiding human contact. The bear had killed at least 4 calves from 3 different ranches, displaying an increasingly bold pattern of behavior that suggested it was losing its natural fear of humans. Most troubling was the discovery that this bear had been previously tagged by Fish, Wildlife and Parks researchers in 2019. Bear number 847, as he was designated in their records, was a 15-year-old male that had been captured and relocated twice for livestock depredations. Each time, wildlife officials had moved him deeper into the wilderness, hoping to break his association between humans and easy food sources. The strategy had apparently failed. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a bear behavior specialist from the University of Montana, studied the dashboard camera footage extensively for her report to the State Wildlife Commission. Her analysis painted a picture of an animal that had completely lost its instinctive fear of humans, seeing them instead as competitors for resources in an increasingly challenging environment. This bear's behavior was highly abnormal, Dr. Vasquez wrote in her report. The sustained nature of the attack, the animal's willingness to remain at the scene despite human presence, and its treatment of Officer Morris as a food source all indicate an animal that had crossed a psychological threshold. Once a bear views humans as prey rather than a threat to be avoided, it becomes extremely dangerous to any person who encounters it. The dashboard camera footage, which captured the initial moments of Kevin's encounter with the bear, became crucial evidence in understanding what had gone wrong. Enhanced audio analysis revealed that Kevin had followed proper protocol in his approach to the animal, speaking in calm, non-threatening tones as he backed away from the carcass. The bear's charge appeared to be triggered not by any aggressive action on Kevin's part, but by the animal's territorial response to what it perceived as a threat to its food source. Kevin's funeral was held on January 25th at the Kalispell Methodist Church, drawing over 800 mourners, including law enforcement officers from across the region. Montana Governor Sarah Blackwell delivered the eulogy, describing Kevin as a brave officer who died protecting the community he loved. His wife of 12 years, Jennifer Morris, was supported by their 2 children, daughter Emma, aged 10, and son Daniel, aged 7, as she accepted the flag that had draped his casket. Jennifer Morris, a teacher at Kalispell Elementary School, struggled with survivor's guilt in the months following Kevin's death. She blamed herself for not insisting that he request backup when he radioed about the bear tracks, a decision that haunted her during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. The couple had planned to take a family vacation to Yellowstone that summer, a trip Kevin had been particularly excited about because he wanted to show the children the wildlife he encountered in his daily patrols. The psychological impact of Kevin's death extended far beyond his immediate family. Officer Daniel Kowalski, Kevin's partner for the past 3 years, requested a transfer to a desk position after experiencing panic attacks whenever he was assigned to patrol the same area where Kevin had died. Dispatcher Maria Santos, who had taken Kevin's final radio calls, began experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and eventually took early retirement from the sheriff's department. The media coverage of Kevin's death brought unwanted attention to the Flathead Valley, with reporters from national news organizations descending on Kalispell to cover what they termed Montana's deadliest bear attack. The sensationalized reporting frustrated local residents who felt that outsiders didn't understand the complex relationship between humans and wildlife in grizzly country. Local rancher Tom Henderson, whose missing calf had been the bear's first known kill, expressed frustration with fish wildlife and parks management policies. "We've been telling them for years that relocating problem bears doesn't work," Henderson told reporters. "They just learn to be better at avoiding detection while they continue to kill livestock. Now a good man is dead because bureaucrats in Helena refuse to make the hard decisions." The controversy surrounding grizzly management in Montana intensified in the wake of Kevin's death. Conservation groups argued that the attack was an isolated incident that shouldn't influence broader wildlife policy, while agricultural interests pushed for more aggressive removal of problem bears. The debate highlighted the ongoing tension between protecting an endangered species and ensuring public safety in areas where humans and grizzlies increasingly shared the same habitat. Fish, wildlife, and parks. Director Michael Harrison faced intense criticism for his agency's handling of bear number 847. Records showed that the animal had been flagged as a high-risk individual after its second relocation, but budget constraints had prevented the kind of intensive monitoring that might have prevented the tragedy. Harrison eventually resigned his position in March 2025, citing the need for new leadership to rebuild public trust in our wildlife management programs. The search for bear number 847 continued throughout the spring of 2025, but with each passing month, the likelihood of finding the animal decreased. Wildlife officials theorized that the bear might have died during hibernation, succumbing to infected wounds from Kevin's gunshots, or simply to the stress of the encounter. Others believed the animal had learned to avoid human detection entirely, becoming a ghost in the vast wilderness that comprised its habitat. In May 2025, hikers discovered what appeared to be bear remains in a remote canyon, approximately 30 miles from the attack site. DNA analysis conducted by the State Crime Lab confirmed that the bones belonged to bear number 847. The animal had apparently died sometime during the winter, possibly from a combination of infected gunshot wounds and malnutrition. The discovery brought some closure to Kevin's family and colleagues, though it did little to ease the ongoing debate about grizzly management in Montana. Dr. Crawford's final report on the incident concluded that multiple factors had contributed to the tragedy. Climate change had disrupted normal hibernation patterns, keeping bears active later into the winter when food sources were scarce. Human development in traditional grizzly habitat had forced animals into closer contact with people, increasing the likelihood of conflicts. Most significantly, current relocation policies had proved inadequate for dealing with bears that had lost their fear of humans. The report recommended sweeping changes to Montana's grizzly management program, including the development of better tracking technology for problem bears, increased funding for conflict prevention programs, and clearer protocols for dealing with animals that had demonstrated aggressive behavior toward humans. Many of these recommendations were implemented in the Kevin Morris Wildlife Safety Act, passed by the Montana legislature in 2026. Kevin's death also prompted changes in law enforcement protocols for wildlife encounters. All Montana Highway Patrol officers now receive enhanced training in bear behavior and safety, and patrol vehicles in grizzly country are equipped with bear spray and specialized ammunition designed for large predators. Officers are also required to wait for Fish, Wildlife and Parks backup before investigating any signs of bear activity. The dashboard camera footage from Kevin's patrol vehicle became a training tool used by law enforcement agencies throughout North America, though its graphic nature required careful consideration of how it was presented. The video clearly showed the speed and power of a charging grizzly, demonstrating why standard law enforcement firearms were largely ineffective against such animals. It also highlighted the importance of early detection and avoidance in preventing bear encounters. Jennifer Morris eventually remarried, finding love again with a fellow teacher named Robert Chen, but she never forgot the man who had died protecting his community. Each year on the anniversary of Kevin's death, she and the children visited his grave in the Kalispell Cemetery, leaving fresh flowers and sharing memories of the husband and father they had lost. Emma and Daniel grew up knowing their father had been a hero, but they also learned to fear the wilderness that had claimed his life. The attack site itself became something of a shrine for Kevin's fellow officers, who occasionally made pilgrimages to the clearing where he had made his final stand. A small wooden cross marked the spot where his body had been found, though the location was deliberately kept secret from the public to prevent it from becoming a morbid tourist attraction. The fallen log where the bear had cached Kevin's body was left undisturbed, slowly returning to the forest floor as nature reclaimed the scene of the tragedy. Years later, wildlife biologist Sarah Thompson would use Kevin's case as part of her doctoral research on human-bear conflicts in the Northern Rockies. Her analysis of the incident revealed patterns that had been overlooked in earlier studies, particularly the role that individual bear personalities played in determining the outcome of encounters with humans. Some bears, Thompson concluded, were simply more aggressive by nature, making them poor candidates for relocation programs regardless of the circumstances. The research also highlighted the importance of understanding bear behavior from the animal's perspective. Bear number 847 had likely viewed the Flathead Valley as his territory, seeing human presence as an intrusion to be defended rather than a threat to be avoided. This territorial mindset, combined with the bear's size and strength, had created a perfect storm of circumstances that led to Kevin's death. Conservation biologist Dr. Maria Santos, no relation to the dispatcher, argued that Kevin's death should serve as a wake-up call about the challenges facing grizzly recovery in the lower 48 states. With suitable habitat becoming increasingly fragmented and human populations growing in traditional bear ranges, conflicts like the one that killed Kevin were likely to become more common unless significant changes were made to how society managed its relationship with large predators. The economic impact of Kevin's death extended beyond the immediate costs of the investigation and search operation. Tourism in the Flathead Valley declined by nearly 15% in the year following the attack, as visitors became more cautious about venturing into areas known for grisly activity. Local outfitters and guides reported increased cancellations, particularly for backcountry trips that took clients into remote areas where bears were more likely to be encountered. Property values in rural areas near the attack site also suffered, as potential buyers became wary of purchasing homes in locations where dangerous wildlife encounters were possible. Real estate agent Linda Watson reported that several deals fell through when buyers learned about Kevin's death, particularly among families with young children who were concerned about safety. The legal ramifications of the incident continued for years after Kevin's death. Jennifer Morris filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Fish, Wildlife and Parks, arguing that the agency's negligent management of bear number 847 had directly contributed to her husband's death. The case eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but not before generating considerable controversy about government liability in wildlife attacks. The settlement established precedent for holding wildlife agencies accountable when their management decisions resulted in preventable human fatalities. Legal experts predicted that the case would influence how government agencies approached wildlife management throughout the United States, potentially leading to more conservative policies that prioritized human safety over wildlife conservation goals. Kevin's story also inspired changes in emergency medical protocols for treating bear attack victims. Dr. Reeves worked with trauma specialists across the region to develop new treatment guidelines specifically designed for the massive injuries typically inflicted by grizzly bears. These protocols emphasized rapid blood loss control and aggressive management of traumatic brain injuries, improvements that had the potential to save lives in future attacks. The helicopter evacuation procedures used during Kevin's rescue were also refined based on lessons learned from the operation. Emergency medical services throughout Montana adopted new equipment and training standards for wilderness rescues, recognizing that traditional urban emergency response methods were inadequate for incidents occurring in remote locations. Training programs for law enforcement officers were expanded to include more comprehensive instruction on wildlife behavior and safety procedures. The Kevin Morris Law Enforcement Wildlife Safety Program became a model for other states, providing officers with the knowledge and tools needed to safely handle encounters with dangerous wildlife while performing their duties. Perhaps most significantly, Kevin's death sparked a broader conversation about the role of humans in wilderness ecosystems and the responsibilities that came with sharing habitat with large predators. Environmental ethicist Dr. Jonathan Reed argued that Kevin's death represented the tragic cost of society's failure to adequately address the challenges of wildlife conservation in an increasingly developed landscape. Officer Morris died because we as a society have been unwilling to make the difficult decisions necessary to manage human-wildlife conflicts effectively, Reed wrote in a paper published by the Journal of Environmental Ethics. His death should serve as a reminder that conservation is not just about protecting animals, but about finding ways for humans and wildlife to coexist safely in shared landscapes. The philosophical implications of Kevin's death were debated in academic circles for years. Some argued that the attack represented the inevitable result of human encroachment into wild spaces, while others maintained that proper management could have prevented the tragedy without compromising conservation goals. Native American perspectives on the incident provided additional insight into the complex cultural dimensions of human-bear relationships. Elder Thomas Whitehorse of the Blackfeet Nation pointed out that traditional indigenous cultures had developed sophisticated systems for coexisting with grizzlies, knowledge that had been largely ignored by contemporary wildlife management approaches. "The bear was only doing what bears do," Whitehorse explained to a gathering of wildlife managers. "The problem was not the bear's behavior, but our failure to understand and respect the animal's nature. Officer Morris died because we have forgotten how to live with our wild neighbors." These cultural perspectives influenced the development of new management approaches that incorporated traditional ecological knowledge alongside modern scientific methods. The integration of indigenous wisdom with contemporary research became a cornerstone of revised grizzly management plans throughout the Northern Rockies. Kevin's children grew up with the complicated legacy of their father's death, proud of his sacrifice while struggling with the reality that their lives had been forever changed by a wild animal. Emma Morris became an advocate for wildlife conservation as an adult, working to develop education programs that taught people how to live safely in bear country. Her work was inspired by the belief that her father's death could serve a greater purpose if it helped prevent similar tragedies. Daniel Morris chose a different path, following in his father's footsteps by becoming a law enforcement officer. He specialized in wildlife crimes, working to protect the same animals that had killed his father while ensuring that dangerous individuals were properly managed. His unique perspective, shaped by personal tragedy, made him an effective advocate for balanced approaches to wildlife management. The anniversary of Kevin's death became an annual opportunity for reflection and remembrance within the law enforcement community. Each January 17th, officers throughout Montana paused to honor their fallen colleague and renew their commitment to serving and protecting their communities, even in the face of extreme danger. The Kevin Morris Memorial Fund, established by his fellow officers, provided financial assistance to families of law enforcement personnel killed or injured in wildlife encounters. The fund also supported research into wildlife safety and conflict prevention, ensuring that Kevin's legacy would contribute to protecting future generations of officers and civilians. Years after the attack, the Flathead Valley continued to grapple with the challenge of balancing human safety with wildlife conservation. New developments were required to include bear-proof garbage storage and lighting designed to minimize attraction to wildlife. Schools implemented bear safety programs for children, teaching them how to recognize and respond to dangerous wildlife encounters. The tourism industry adapted as well, with guide services offering specialized bear safety training for visitors to the region. Hotels and campgrounds posted detailed information about bear behavior and safety precautions, and many required guests to complete safety briefings before venturing into backcountry areas. Local government officials worked to implement zoning regulations that reduced the likelihood of human-bear conflicts, requiring setbacks from known travel corridors and limiting development in areas with high wildlife activity. These measures represented a significant shift from earlier approaches that had prioritized economic development over environmental considerations. The scientific community continued to study the incident for insights into bear behavior and management strategies. Kevin's case became a textbook example of how individual animal behavior could deviate from expected patterns, highlighting the importance of considering personality differences in wildlife management decisions. Research into bear, number 847's background, revealed a pattern of increasingly bold behavior that should have triggered more aggressive intervention. The animal had been involved in several unreported encounters with humans prior to its first capture, incidents that might have provided early warning signs of its dangerous tendencies if they had been properly documented and analyzed. This revelation led to improved reporting systems for wildlife encounters, encouraging the public to report all bear sightings and interactions to create more comprehensive databases for tracking individual animal behavior. The enhanced data collection allowed wildlife managers to identify problem animals earlier and take appropriate action before they became dangerous. Technological advances also played a role in improving wildlife management following Kevin's death. GPS collars became more sophisticated and affordable, allowing researchers to track problem bears more effectively. Motion-activated cameras were deployed throughout the region to monitor wildlife movement patterns and identify potentially dangerous animals. Genetic analysis techniques improved as well, enabling researchers to identify individual bears from hair and scat samples without the need for capture. This non-invasive monitoring provided valuable data about bear behavior and population dynamics while minimizing stress on the animals. The development of new, non-lethal deterrent technologies offered additional options for managing problem bears. Advanced bear spray formulations proved more effective at deterring aggressive animals, while acoustic and light-based deterrents showed promise for preventing bears from entering human-inhabited areas. Training programs for wildlife managers were enhanced to include more comprehensive instruction on risk assessment and decision-making in complex situations. The Kevin Morris case study became a standard component of these programs, providing real-world examples of how quickly situations could escalate and the importance of taking decisive action when public safety was at risk. International collaboration increased as well, with wildlife managers from Alaska, Canada, and the lower 48 states sharing information and best practices for grizzly management. The global perspective provided valuable insights into successful coexistence strategies from other regions with large bear populations. Kevin's death also influenced policy discussions at the federal level, where debates about grizzly bear, delisting and management responsibility continued to evolve. The incident provided opponents of delisting with a powerful example of the challenges facing state wildlife agencies, while supporters argued that federal oversight had contributed to the management failures that led to the tragedy. The broader implications of Kevin's death extended to discussions about climate change and its impact on wildlife behavior. The disrupted hibernation patterns that had kept bear number 847 active during what should have been its denning period were linked to changing weather patterns throughout the region. Scientists documented increasing numbers of bears remaining active later into the winter, creating more opportunities for human-wildlife conflicts during periods when people were less prepared for such encounters. The trend highlighted the need for adaptive management strategies that could respond to changing environmental conditions. Kevin Morris died doing what he loved, protecting the people and landscapes of Montana. His death was a tragedy, but it was not meaningless. The changes implemented in response to his killing created a safer environment for both humans and wildlife, ensuring that his sacrifice would contribute to the prevention of future tragedies. The story of Kevin Morris and bear number 847 became a cautionary tale about the challenges of conservation in an increasingly complex world. It demonstrated that good intentions and traditional approaches were not always sufficient to address the evolving dynamics of human-wildlife interactions in the 21st century. Most importantly, Kevin's death reminded everyone involved in wildlife management that their decisions had real-world consequences for real people. Behind every policy debate and management decision were individuals like Kevin Morris, dedicated public servants who put their lives on the line to protect their communities. As the years passed and the immediate shock of Kevin's death faded, his legacy continued to influence how society approached the challenge of coexisting with dangerous wildlife. His story served as a reminder that conservation was not just about protecting animals, but about finding ways for humans and wildlife to share the landscape safely and sustainably. The grizzly bear that killed Officer Kevin Morris on January 17, 2025, had been dead for months when its remains were finally discovered. But the impact of that 4-minute encounter in a snow-covered clearing continued to reverberate through the wildlife management community, law enforcement agencies, and the broader public for years to come. Kevin's dashboard camera had captured the last moments of his life, but more importantly, it had documented a tragedy that would ultimately make the world a little bit safer for everyone who ventured into the wild places where humans and bears must learn to coexist. In the end, perhaps that was the most fitting memorial to a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others, that his death would serve to protect future generations from experiencing the same fate. The next story is Grizzly Bear Attacks Police Officers. During traffic stop, October 14, 2024. The October wind carried the scent of pine and early snow down from the Teton Range as Officer Daniel Ross adjusted his patrol car's position along Highway 191, just north of Jackson, Wyoming. The digital clock on his dashboard read 3:47 p.m., and the autumn light was already beginning its slow fade behind the jagged peaks that dominated the western horizon. Beside him, Officer Miguel Alvarez finished his coffee and crumpled the paper cup, tossing it into the small wastebasket they kept wedged between their seats. "Another quiet Monday in paradise," Miguel said, his voice carrying the slight accent that betrayed his childhood in El Paso, though he'd called Wyoming home for the past 8 years. At 34, he was 2 years younger than Daniel, but had been with the Teton County Sheriff's Office for nearly a decade. His dark hair was beginning to show flecks of gray at the temples, something his wife Carmen teased him about relentlessly. Daniel Ross had the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his 46 years outdoors. Born and raised in Jackson Hole, he'd watched the valley transform from a quiet ranching community into a playground for the wealthy, complete with million-dollar homes and world-class ski resorts. His grandfather had been a guide for wealthy eastern hunters in the 1940s, and Daniel himself had worked as a wilderness guide before joining law enforcement 15 years ago. The job paid better than guiding, and it meant he could support his wife Sarah and their twin daughters Emma and Sophie, now juniors at Jackson Hole High School. The radio crackled to life with the familiar voice of dispatcher Linda Kowalski. "All units, be advised we have reports of increased grizzly activity in the Moose-Wilson area. Fish and Wildlife recommends extra caution for any calls in that sector." Miguel keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. We're currently positioned on 191, about 5 miles north of town. Any specific incidents we should be aware of?" Unit 7. Fish and Wildlife reported a female grizzly with cubs spotted near the Gros Ventre River yesterday. Also had a report of garbage cans being raided at the Teton Village area overnight. Standard precautions advised. Daniel nodded as Miguel acknowledged the transmission. This time of year, bears were in hyperphagia, desperately consuming calories before winter hibernation. It made them more aggressive, more likely to venture into areas they might normally avoid. He'd grown up hearing stories from his grandfather about bears, and he'd seen his share during his guiding days. The key was respect and distance. "Remember that call last month?" Miguel asked, settling back in his seat. "That tourist from Connecticut who wanted to take a selfie with the bear cub?" "Don't remind me," Daniel replied, shaking his head. 40-year-old investment banker with more money than sense. Thank God the mama bear was more interested in the berry bushes than playing photographer. The afternoon stretched on with the usual mix of radio chatter and scenic patrol. They'd responded to a minor fender bender near the airport, checked on an elderly rancher who'd called about suspicious activity that turned out to be his own nephew fixing a fence, and issued 3 speeding tickets to tourists heading back from Grand Teton National Park. By 6:15 p.m., the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been picture-perfect on any other day. "One more pass through the north end, then we'll head back to the station," Daniel said, turning the patrol car around at the Moose Junction. The traffic had thinned considerably as the day trippers headed back to their hotels and the locals settled in for dinner. That's when they spotted the red Ford pickup truck weaving slightly across the center line about half a mile ahead. "Looks like we've got a possible DUI," Miguel observed, already reaching for his seatbelt to check that it was secure. Daniel activated the patrol car's overhead lights and accelerated to close the distance. The pickup's brake lights flashed erratically as the driver apparently noticed the police presence. Then the vehicle pulled over onto a wide shoulder area surrounded by dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. Daniel positioned their patrol car about 30 feet behind the pickup, angling it slightly to provide some protection from passing traffic. The shoulder here was unusually wide, almost like a small parking area, probably created by highway maintenance crews. Beyond the tree line, the forest stretched back into darkness, part of the vast wilderness that surrounded Jackson Hole on all sides. "Wyoming plates. Looks like a local," Miguel said, squinting at the license plate. "Running it now." He typed the plate number into their mobile data terminal while Daniel observed the pickup. A single occupant, male, appeared to be fumbling around in the cab, possibly looking for his registration. Plate comes back to Robert James Mitchell, 43 years old, address in Wilson. 2 prior DUIs, last one was 3 years ago. License is valid. Daniel nodded and opened his door. "Standard approach. I'll take lead. You back me up." Miguel stepped out of the passenger side, his hand instinctively checking that his service weapon was secure in its holster. The October air was crisp and sharp in his lungs, carrying the scent of pine sap and the faint musk that seemed to permeate all of Wyoming in the fall. Somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled, its haunting call echoing off the mountains. Daniel approached the driver's side window while Miguel took position slightly behind and to the right, maintaining visual contact with both the driver and the surrounding area. This was routine, something they'd done hundreds of times before. The driver, a heavy-set man with graying beard stubble, was indeed fumbling through his glove compartment. "Good evening, sir. I'm Officer Ross with the Teton County Sheriff's Office. The reason I stopped you today is that I observed your vehicle crossing the center line several times. Can I see your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance?" Robert Mitchell looked up with bloodshot eyes and the unmistakable smell of alcohol on his breath. "Officer, I just had a couple beers with lunch. I wasn't speeding or nothing." "Sir, I'll need to see those documents, please," Daniel replied calmly. He'd heard the same excuse countless times before. Mitchell's movements were slow and uncoordinated as he finally located his wallet and began extracting his driver's license. Miguel was watching the exchange when he first noticed the movement in the tree line about 50 yards away. At first, he thought it might be an elk or deer, common enough in this area. But something about the motion seemed different, more deliberate. He kept one eye on the traffic stop while scanning the forest edge. That's when he saw her. The grizzly bear emerged from behind a massive Douglas fir like a shadow given substance. Even in the fading light, Miguel could see that this was a large female, probably weighing close to 400 pounds. Her thick brown coat was tinged with silver tips that caught the last rays of sunlight, and her massive head swayed back and forth as she tested the air with her nose. "Daniel," Miguel said quietly, not wanting to startle either the bear or the driver, "we've got company." 3 o'clock, about 50 yards out. Daniel glanced over while maintaining his position at the driver's window. The bear was now fully visible at the edge of the clearing, standing on her hind legs to get a better view and scent picture of the situation. Standing upright, she was over 7 feet tall, an impressive and intimidating sight. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay in your vehicle and remain calm," Daniel said to Mitchell, who was still fumbling with his license. "Do not get out of the truck under any circumstances." The bear dropped back to all fours and took several steps closer. Miguel could now see that her ears were pinned back against her head, a clear sign of agitation. Her massive paws made almost no sound on the forest floor, despite her enormous size. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7, Miguel spoke into his radio, keeping his voice low and calm. "We have a large grizzly bear approaching our location during a traffic stop. We're on Highway 191, approximately 5 miles north of Jackson, requesting backup and fish and wildlife response. Unit 7, backup is en route. Estimated arrival time 12 minutes. Are you in immediate danger?" Miguel watched as the bear continued her approach. She was now about 30 yards away and showing all the classic signs of a defensive bear, ears back, head lowered, making huffing sounds. "Unclear at this time, dispatch." The bear appears agitated and is continuing to approach. Daniel had moved away from the pickup truck and was now standing next to Miguel. Both officers had their hands near their service weapons, but hadn't drawn them yet. Standard protocol was to avoid confrontation with wildlife whenever possible, and shooting a grizzly bear was considered an absolute last resort. "She's got cubs," Daniel said quietly, spotting 2 small shapes moving in the shadows behind the female. That explains the defensive behavior. The presence of cubs changed everything. A mother grizzly with young was one of the most dangerous situations they could encounter in the wilderness. She would perceive any threat, real or imagined, as a mortal danger to her offspring and would fight with lethal ferocity to protect them. The bear was now close enough that they could hear her breathing, heavy and labored. Her small, dark eyes were fixed on the 2 officers, and she began making a popping sound with her jaws, another clear warning sign. "Back to the car, slowly," Daniel whispered. They began moving backward toward their patrol vehicle, maintaining eye contact with the bear while avoiding any sudden movements. That's when Robert Mitchell, apparently oblivious to the developing situation and still intoxicated, opened his truck door and stepped out. "What the hell is going on here?" he slurred loudly. "I got my license right here." The sudden noise and movement triggered the grizzly's defensive instincts. She let out a massive roar that echoed through the forest and charged directly at the group, covering the 30 yards between them in just a few seconds. Her massive paws pounded against the asphalt with thunderous impacts, and her jaws were open, revealing teeth that were over an inch long. "Get in the truck!" Daniel shouted to Mitchell while drawing his service weapon. Miguel had also drawn his pistol, but the bear was moving so fast that they barely had time to aim. Mitchell, suddenly sobered by the sight of 400 pounds of enraged grizzly bear charging toward him, scrambled back toward his truck, but tripped over his own feet and fell hard onto the asphalt. The bear's charge carried her directly into Miguel Alvarez. Despite his quick reflexes and years of training, there was simply no time to get out of the way. The impact knocked him backward with tremendous force, his service weapon flying from his hand and skittering across the pavement. Daniel fired 3 quick shots, but the bear's thick hide and layers of fat made it difficult to deliver an immediately incapacitating wound. The bullets struck her in the shoulder and side, causing her to roar in pain and fury, but not stopping her attack. Miguel tried to roll away from the bear's massive paws, but one swipe caught him across the chest, tearing through his uniform shirt and protective vest like they were made of paper. The bear's claws, each one over 3 inches long, opened 3 deep gashes across his ribcage. "Miguel!" Daniel shouted, continuing to fire at the bear while trying to maneuver for a better angle. The massive animal was now directly on top of his partner, using her weight to pin him to the ground while attempting to bite his head and neck. Miguel managed to get his arms up to protect his face, but the bear's jaws clamped down on his left forearm with crushing force. The bones snapped audibly, and Miguel's scream of pain cut through the evening air. Daniel emptied his magazine into the bear's side and back, finally striking something vital. The grizzly released Miguel's arm and turned toward Daniel with a roar that seemed to shake the ground itself. Blood was now flowing from multiple wounds, but her fury was undiminished. She charged Daniel, but he had managed to put the patrol car between himself and the bear. The animal's momentum carried her into the side of the vehicle with a tremendous crash, denting the door and shattering the driver's side window. Daniel was frantically trying to reload his weapon when the bear came around the front of the patrol car. At close range, he could see the intelligence in her dark eyes, along with a primal fury that chilled him to the bone. The bear reared up on her hind legs again, towering over Daniel, and brought her massive paws down toward his head. He managed to duck to the side, but one paw caught him across the back, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. Daniel rolled over to see the bear standing directly above him, blood dripping from her multiple wounds onto his uniform. Her jaws opened wide, revealing her massive canine teeth, and he knew that the next few seconds would determine whether he lived or died. That's when the backup units arrived. The sound of sirens and the sight of additional vehicles approaching seemed to confuse the bear. She looked around uncertainly, then seemed to remember her cubs, who were crying from the edge of the forest. With one final roar in Daniel's direction, she turned and lumbered back toward the tree line, leaving a trail of blood behind her. Officers Jake Brennan and Lisa Chen were first on scene, followed closely by Sergeant Tom Harrison. They found Daniel conscious but badly injured, with deep gashes across his back and shoulders. Miguel was unconscious and bleeding heavily from his mangled forearm and the claw marks across his chest. "Get the medical bag," Daniel gasped, trying to sit up. "Miguel's hurt bad." Lisa Chen was already calling for life flight, while Jake Brennan applied pressure to Miguel's wounds. The nearest hospital was St. John's Medical Center in Jackson, about 20 minutes by ambulance. But Miguel's injuries were severe enough that helicopter transport might be necessary. Robert Mitchell was found cowering behind his pickup truck, uninjured but in shock. He would later have no clear memory of the attack, though the alcohol in his system was undoubtedly a contributing factor to his poor decision-making. The grizzly bear and her cubs disappeared into the forest, but the trail of blood was easy to follow. Within an hour, Wyoming Game and Fish Warden Sarah Martinez arrived on scene with a team of wildlife specialists. They would track the wounded bear through the night, ultimately finding her body about 2 miles from the attack site. She had died from the gunshot wounds, leaving her 2 cubs orphaned. Miguel Alvarez was airlifted to Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center in Idaho Falls, where a team of trauma surgeons worked through the night to save his life. The damage to his left arm was severe, requiring multiple surgeries and the insertion of titanium plates to repair the shattered bones. The claw marks across his chest had come dangerously close to puncturing his lung, but the trauma team managed to repair the damage. Daniel Ross was treated at St. John's Medical Center for his injuries, which included deep lacerations across his back and shoulders, along with a mild concussion from when he hit the pavement. He was released the following morning, but would require physical therapy for several months. The investigation into the incident took several weeks to complete. Security camera footage from a nearby business captured part of the attack, providing clear evidence that the officers had followed proper protocols and had used lethal force only when absolutely necessary to protect themselves and the civilian. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department determined that the bear had likely been attracted to the area by garbage from nearby campsites and had become habituated to human presence. The presence of cubs had made her extremely defensive, and the sudden appearance of multiple humans in what she perceived as her territory had triggered the attack. Robert Mitchell was eventually charged with DUI and endangering the lives of police officers, though his attorney argued that his intoxication prevented him from understanding the danger posed by the bear. The case would drag through the courts for over a year before being resolved with a plea agreement. Miguel Alvarez spent 3 weeks in the hospital and underwent 4 separate surgeries to repair the damage to his arm and chest. The physical therapy was long and painful, but he gradually regained most of the use of his left arm. The psychological trauma, however, proved more difficult to overcome. Both officers were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder following the attack. Daniel returned to duty after 3 months of counseling and rehabilitation, but Miguel never felt comfortable in the field again. The sound of radio static or the sight of dense forest would trigger panic attacks, and he eventually took early retirement from the sheriff's office. The attack made national news, highlighting the increasing conflicts between humans and wildlife in the rapidly developing American West. Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks implemented new protocols for dealing with bear encounters, and local law enforcement agencies received additional training in wildlife safety. The 2 orphaned bear cubs were captured by wildlife officials and eventually relocated to a wildlife sanctuary in Montana, where they would spend the rest of their lives in captivity. It was a tragic ending for animals that had simply been following their mother's lead in defending what they perceived as their territory. For Daniel Ross, the attack was a stark reminder of the dangers that came with law enforcement in one of America's last wild places. Every traffic stop, every call for service carried the potential for unexpected danger, whether from human criminals or the wild animals that still called the greater Yellowstone ecosystem home. 6 months after the attack, Daniel was back on patrol along Highway 191. He still carried the scars from the bear's claws, both physical and emotional, but he had not lost his respect for the wilderness that surrounded his hometown. If anything, the encounter had deepened his understanding of the delicate balance between human development and wildlife habitat. The memorial service for the grizzly bear might have seemed unusual to outsiders, but it reflected the complex relationship between the people of Jackson Hole and the wild animals that shared their valley. The bear had been doing what came naturally to her, protecting her young from perceived threats. The tragedy was not that she had attacked, but that the circumstances had made the encounter inevitable. Miguel Alvarez moved his family to Colorado Springs the following year, taking a job with the Colorado Department of Transportation that kept him safely away from both law enforcement and wildlife encounters. He still woke up some nights in a cold sweat, remembering the sound of the bear's roar and the feeling of helplessness as those massive jaws closed around his arm. Daniel Ross continued his career with the Teton County Sheriff's Office, eventually becoming a training officer responsible for educating new recruits about wildlife safety. He would tell them that respect for nature was not just about environmental stewardship, but about survival in a place where humans were not always at the top of the food chain. The attack site on Highway 191 was marked with a small memorial plaque, not for the officers who survived, but for the grizzly bear who died protecting her young. It serves as a reminder to all who pass by that in the American West, the wilderness is never far away, and the ancient laws of survival still apply to those who venture into the domain of the wild.